Prologue, Facing Trauma. The prologue of The Body Keeps the Score opens with Bessel van der Kolk reflecting on his decades-long career as a psychiatrist and researcher, tracing the evolution of his understanding of trauma from his earliest days working with veterans to his current practice. He begins with a vivid recollection of his time at the Boston Veterans Administration Clinic in the late 1970s, where he first encountered men who had returned from the Vietnam War shattered in ways that the medical establishment could neither name nor adequately treat. These veterans were not simply suffering from memories of war, they were reliving it. Their bodies were stuck in a perpetual state of alert, reacting to everyday stimuli as if they were still under fire. Van der Kolk describes sitting with a man named Tom, a former combat medic who could not enter a crowded supermarket without experiencing a full-blown physiological panic response. Tom's heart would race, his palms would sweat, and he would be overwhelmed by an urge to dive behind the produce section for cover. The sound of a car backfiring would send him to the floor. These were not mere psychological quirks. These were the body's deeply encoded survival responses, hijacking the present moment with the terror of the past. Van der Kolk explains that at the time, the psychiatric profession was dominated by a focus on talk therapy and pharmaceutical interventions. The prevailing wisdom held that traumatic memories could be processed and neutralized through language, through carefully revisiting the past in a safe therapeutic environment and reframing the narrative. The tool of choice was medication, particularly drugs that targeted serotonin and other neurotransmitters designed to dampen the overwhelming emotions that plagued traumatized patients. Yet Van der Kolk observed with growing frustration that these methods were often strikingly inadequate. His patients could talk about their experiences for years, could intellectually understand the origins of their suffering, and could take a cocktail of pills to manage their anxiety and depression, and still they remained profoundly, viscerally unwell. Their bodies refused to believe they were safe. Something deeper, something pre-verbal and physiological, remained untouched by words and chemicals. This realization crystallized for Van der Kolk through a series of encounters and clinical observations that he shares in the prologue. He describes attending a lecture by a visiting neuroscientist who presented early research on how extreme stress alters the brain's fundamental architecture. The amygdala, the brain's smoke detector, becomes hyperreactive in traumatized individuals, constantly scanning the environment for threats and sounding false alarms. Meanwhile, the prefrontal cortex, the seat of rational thought and impulse control, goes dim, its ability to inhibit the fear response severely compromised. But the most compelling piece of the puzzle came from a different area of study entirely. Van der Kolk learned about the work of researchers exploring the role of the body in emotion and memory. He read about how sensory experiences, smells, sounds, physical sensations, and visceral feelings are processed in the deep, nonverbal regions of the brain, and how these somatic imprints can linger long after the conscious memory of an event has faded. A traumatized person might not remember the exact sequence of an assault, but their body remembers the pressure on their chest, the taste of fear in their mouth, the gut-wrenching sensation of helplessness. This bodily memory, he realized, is the core of traumatic suffering. The prologue recounts a pivotal moment in Van der Kolk's intellectual journey when he began to experiment with therapies that engaged the body directly. He describes his initial skepticism and eventual astonishment as he witnessed patients find relief through practices like yoga, theater, and eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, EMDR. He observed that when patients were guided to notice the physical sensations accompanying their traumatic memories, to track the tension in their muscles, the shallowness of their breath, or the churning in their stomach, something shifted. The memories lost their terrifying grip. The past began to feel like the past. This was not a cognitive process, but an organic, bottom-up recalibration of the nervous system. Van der Kolk found that for healing to occur, the body itself needed to learn that the danger had passed and that it could rest in the present moment. The rational brain alone could not deliver this message. It had to be felt. Van der Kolk also situates his personal journey within a broader historical and cultural context. He discusses the long and troubled history of how society has dealt with psychological trauma. He references the work of early pioneers like Pierre Janet and Sigmund Freud, who first recognized that traumatic memories are fundamentally different from ordinary memories, existing as unprocessed fragments that intrude on the present. He then charts the episodic waves of societal attention to trauma, from the interest in hysteria at the Salpêtrière Hospital in late 19th century Paris, to the shell-shock epidemics of the First and Second World Wars, to the eventual recognition of post-traumatic stress disorder as a formal diagnosis in the wake of the Vietnam War. Each time, van der Kolk notes, society has rediscovered trauma only to lapse back into a collective amnesia, forgetting the hard-won lessons of the previous generation. He frames his own book as an urgent call to break this cycle of forgetting, to consolidate the revolutionary insights of neuroscience, developmental psychopathology, and interpersonal neurobiology into a coherent, accessible framework that can change how we understand and treat human suffering. The prologue concludes with a powerful and personal statement of purpose. Van der Kolk dedicates his life's work to the countless patients who have taught him what trauma truly is, a wound not just of the mind, but of the entire organism. He writes that trauma is a fact of life, but it does not have to be a life sentence. The body keeps the score, holding the imprints of every tear and every helplessness, but it also holds the keys to recovery. By learning to listen to the body's language, by understanding how trauma reshapes both brain and physiology, and by developing interventions that foster genuine safety and self-regulation, we can help people reclaim their lives. This book, he promises, is a map of that terrain, a synthesis of science and clinical wisdom intended for survivors, their loved ones, and the clinicians who serve them. It is an invitation to understand the deepest roots of trauma and to discover the pathways that lead, slowly and painstakingly, back to a sense of agency, connection, and aliveness. Chapter 1: Lessons from Vietnam Veterans. The first chapter of The Body Keeps the Score begins with van der Kolk plunging the reader directly into the clinical crucible that forged his earliest understanding of trauma, his work with Vietnam War veterans at the Boston Veterans Administration Clinic in the late 1970s. He paints a vivid and unflinching portrait of the men who came home from the war, carrying invisible wounds so profound that decades later, they remained prisoners of their combat experiences. These were not men who simply had bad memories of the war. These were men for whom the war was not over and perhaps never would be. Van der Kolk introduces us to several veterans whose stories become the foundational case studies of the chapter, each illustrating a different facet of traumatic suffering that the existing psychiatric frameworks utterly failed to capture. He describes a man who every night for over a decade had fought the Battle of Khe Sanh in his sleep, waking up drenched in sweat, his wife bearing the bruises of his nocturnal combat. He describes another veteran who had constructed an elaborate ritual around the 4th of July, retreating to a remote cabin in the woods each year, armed and alone, because the sound of fireworks triggered an overwhelming compulsion to find cover and return fire. The specific details of their suffering were unique, but the underlying architecture was disturbingly consistent. The sensory imprints of the war, the smell of diesel fuel, the thump of helicopter blades, the crack of gunfire were etched into their nervous systems, ready to be reactivated at any moment with the full force of the original terror. Van der Kolk details his early attempts to treat these men using the tools he had been taught in his psychiatric training, primarily a combination of talking and medication. The results were deeply discouraging. He describes the process of asking veterans to recount their traumatic experiences in detail, a staple of traditional therapy, and watching them become physically dysregulated in front of him. Their breathing would become shallow and rapid. Their faces would flush or blanch. They would sweat profusely. Some would dissociate, their eyes going flat and distant as if a protective curtain had descended over their consciousness. They could narrate the facts of what had happened to them, but the telling did not bring relief. Instead, it often seemed to re-traumatize them, thrusting them back into the horror without providing any resolution. Van der Kolk writes that he began to feel that the talking cure was for these patients a reliving cure, a painful exercise in opening wounds without healing them. The medications he prescribed, The tricyclic antidepressants and early iterations of what would become SSRIs helped to blunt some of the overwhelming emotions, but they did not touch the core of the problem. The veterans remained emotionally numb, cut off from loved ones, unable to experience pleasure, and perpetually on guard against a threat that no longer existed. The chapter then widens its lens to explore the cultural and institutional context in which van der Kolk was working. He describes a psychiatric establishment that was, at the time, deeply resistant to the idea that traumatic events could cause lasting psychological damage. The dominant psychoanalytic paradigm held that adult mental illness was primarily rooted in the unresolved conflicts of early childhood. Soldiers who broke down under the strain of combat were often seen as having pre-existing weaknesses or character defects. Their suffering was a sign of an inadequate personality structure, not a normal response to abnormal circumstances. This perspective had devastating consequences. Veterans felt shamed and pathologized by the very professionals who were supposed to help them. They were told, implicitly or explicitly, that their inability to simply move on from the war was a personal failing. Van der Kolk writes with palpable frustration about the blind spots of his own profession, the ways in which psychiatric theories could become dogmas that prevented clinicians from truly listening to their patients. He describes the struggle of a small group of researchers and clinicians, himself included, to have the diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder formally recognized by the American Psychiatric Association, a battle that culminated in the inclusion of PTSD in the third edition of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders in 1980. This was a political and professional victory, but van der Kolk acknowledges that a diagnostic label, however validating, did not solve the fundamental mystery of how to actually heal the wounds of trauma. A significant portion of the chapter is devoted to the physiological dimensions of traumatic stress that van der Kolk and his colleagues were beginning to document. He describes early experiments in which they measured the heart rate, blood pressure, and stress hormone levels of veterans while exposing them to combat-related stimuli, such as the sound of helicopters or recorded battle noises. The results were dramatic and alarming. These men did not simply remember their trauma. Their bodies reenacted it in real time. Their physiological responses spiked as if they were back in the jungles of Vietnam. Their hearts pounding at emergency speeds, their muscles tensing for action, their stress hormone systems flooding their bloodstreams with cortisol and adrenaline. Van der Kolk was struck by the fact that these responses occurred even in veterans who claimed they felt emotionally numb or detached. The body, he realized, was keeping the score even when the conscious mind had walled itself off from the memory. This finding was a revelation with profound clinical implications. If trauma was stored in the body, then perhaps the body needed to be part of the healing process. Van der Kolk also introduces in this chapter the crucial concept of the traumatic reenactment, the compulsive tendency of traumatized individuals to recreate elements of their original trauma in their current lives. He describes veterans who gravitated toward dangerous jobs, who became police officers, firefighters, or mercenaries, constantly seeking the adrenaline rush of life-threatening situations. Others reenacted their trauma in more destructive ways through violence, self-harm, or toxic relationships that mirrored the dynamics of the original abuse. Van der Kolk writes about a veteran who had participated in a horrific massacre of Vietnamese civilians and who, years later, found himself inexplicably drawn to situations where he would be the perpetrator or victim of aggression. The drive to reenact, van der Kolk suggests, is not a simple matter of masochism or moral failing. It is a complex and desperate attempt by the traumatized organism to master the overwhelming experience, to finally get the ending right, to triumph over the helplessness that was the core of the original trauma. But because the underlying trauma remains unprocessed, the reenactment only perpetuates the cycle of suffering. The chapter closes with van der Kolk reflecting on the profound lessons the Vietnam veterans taught him. They showed him that trauma is not primarily a story about the past that can be edited and reframed through conversation. It is an imprint on the body, the brain, and the nervous system that keeps the survivor trapped in a present that feels indistinguishable from the moment of the original threat. The veterans taught him that to understand trauma, one must understand the intricate systems by which the body perceives danger. mounts a response, and, in healthy circumstances, returns to a baseline of safety and calm. In traumatized individuals, this return system is broken. The alarm never stops ringing. Van der Kolk concludes the chapter by noting that these early clinical experiences with veterans planted the seeds for his lifelong quest to understand how the brain and body process overwhelming experiences and, more importantly, how the natural process of recovery can be revived. The veterans were his first and most demanding teachers, and their suffering illuminated the path that the rest of his career would follow. A path away from the exclusive focus on words and pills and toward a more holistic understanding of healing that engaged the whole human organism. Chapter 2. Revolutions in Understanding Mind and Brain. The second chapter of The Body keeps the score charts the seismic shifts in neuroscience and psychopharmacology that transformed psychiatry in the final decades of the 20th century. And Van der Kolk begins by placing himself squarely in the middle of this revolution as both a participant and increasingly a skeptic. He describes the excitement and optimism that swept through the profession in the 1980s and 1990s as new brain imaging technologies such as positron emission tomography (PET), scans and functional magnetic resonance imaging (fMRI) promised to finally reveal the biological underpinnings of mental illness. For the first time in history, researchers could peer into the living human brain and watch it in action, observing which regions lit up or went dark in response to various stimuli. Van der Kolk writes with genuine awe about the early days of this research, recalling his visits to laboratories where scientists were mapping the neural circuits of emotion and memory and fear. The old psychoanalytic models, with their abstract constructs of id, ego, and superego, suddenly seemed antiquated and almost quaint. In their place was emerging a new, biologically grounded understanding of the mind as the product of complex neural networks, neurotransmitter systems, and electrochemical processes. This was a genuine scientific revolution, and Van der Kolk was initially swept up in its promise. The chapter then introduces the reader to the fundamental architecture of the brain, what Van der Kolk calls the triune brain, a simplified but clinically useful model that divides the brain into three interconnected layers that evolved sequentially over millions of years. The oldest part, the reptilian brain, located in the brainstem and cerebellum, governs the most basic survival functions: breathing, heart rate, digestion, and the fight or flight response. This is the part of the brain that is fully operational at birth and that responds to threats with reflexive automatic actions that bypass conscious thought entirely. Above the reptilian brain sits the limbic system, sometimes called the mammalian brain, which is the seat of emotion, memory, and social attachment. The limbic system includes structures like the amygdala, the brain's alarm system that rapidly assesses incoming stimuli for threat, and the hippocampus, which organizes and contextualizes memories and helps us distinguish between past and present. The newest layer, the neocortex, is the crowning achievement of human evolution. It is the seat of rational thought, language, abstract reasoning, and self-awareness. The frontal lobes, in particular, act as the brain's executive control center, allowing us to plan, reflect, inhibit impulses, and integrate information from the lower brain regions into a coherent, conscious experience. Van der Kolk then uses this triune model to explain the core pathology of trauma in a way that is both scientifically rigorous and powerfully accessible. In a traumatized person, he explains, the delicate balance between these three brain systems is catastrophically disrupted. The reptilian brain, responsible for survival, becomes hyperactive, constantly preparing the body for an emergency that is not actually happening. The limbic system's amygdala becomes hypersensitized, firing off alarms at the slightest provocation, misinterpreting neutral stimuli as mortal threats. A Vietnam veteran hears a car backfire and his amygdala reacts as if he is under enemy fire. A survivor of childhood abuse sees a person who vaguely resembles her abuser and her entire stress response system goes into overdrive. Meanwhile, the hippocampus, which is supposed to provide the context that this is a car backfiring on a peaceful American street, not an ambush in the jungle, is impaired in its function. Traumatic memories are not properly integrated into the narrative timeline of a person's life. They remain as fragmented, sensory-laden, present-tense experiences, unmoored from the past. And perhaps most critically, the frontal lobes, the rational brain that should be able to calm the amygdala down and say, "You are safe now. This is just a memory." Go offline during traumatic reenactments. The result is a person who is neurologically unable to simply reason their way out of their terror. The thinking brain is no longer in control. The survival brain has taken over. The chapter takes a darker turn as van der Kolk recounts the parallel revolution that was occurring in psychopharmacology. In the late 1980s, a new class of antidepressant medications, the selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, SSRIs, like Prozac, entered the market and rapidly became bestsellers. Van der Kolk describes the initial excitement within psychiatry, the hope that these drugs, by correcting chemical imbalances in the brain, might offer a simple, elegant solution to a wide range of mental health problems, including trauma. He writes candidly about his own participation in some of the early clinical trials for these drugs, and his initial impression that they were genuinely helpful for some patients. The drugs could dampen the intensity of overwhelming emotions, making it easier for people to function in their daily lives. But van der Kolk soon began to notice troubling patterns. The drugs did not, he observed, actually resolve trauma. They managed its symptoms, and in doing so, they often became a permanent crutch. Patients who stopped taking the medication frequently found their symptoms returning with full force because the underlying dysregulation of their nervous systems had never been addressed. More disturbingly, van der Kolk began to see a profound shift in the culture of psychiatry itself. The biological revolution, for all its genuine insights, was leading to a narrowing of clinical practice. Therapy sessions, which once involved extended, in-depth conversations about a patient's life history, relationships, and inner world, were increasingly replaced by 15-minute medication checks. The goal became finding the right pill to dull the symptoms, rather than understanding the whole person and addressing the root causes of their suffering. Van der Kolk is careful not to dismiss the value of neuroscience or medication entirely. He acknowledges that the brain imaging studies have provided crucial validation for trauma survivors, offering tangible, visible proof that their suffering is not a character flaw or a failure of willpower, but a real, biological injury. A brain scan showing a deactivated frontal lobe and a hyperactive amygdala during a traumatic flashback is a powerful antidote to the shame and self-blame that so many survivors carry. Similarly, he acknowledges that medications can be life-saving in certain circumstances, helping to stabilize a person enough that they can begin the deeper work of therapy. But the central argument of the chapter, and in many ways of the entire book, is that the biological revolution, in its triumph, lost something essential. It lost sight of the fact that human beings are not just a collection of neural circuits and neurotransmitter levels. We are relational creatures, shaped by our connections to others, our histories, our cultures, and our inner sense of meaning and purpose. Trauma, van der Kolk insists, is not simply a chemical imbalance that can be corrected with a pill. It is a rupture in the fabric of the self, a profound injury to the human spirit that requires a healing process that engages not just the brain, but the mind and the body in their entirety. The chapter concludes with van der Kolk reflecting on a pivotal moment in his own intellectual development. He describes attending a conference where a leading neuroscientist presented dazzling images of the traumatized brain, showing with great precision which areas were overactive and which were underactive. During the question and answer period, van der Kolk raised his hand and asked, "So, now that we know which parts of the brain are damaged, how do we fix them? How do we help people learn to turn off their alarms and feel safe again?" The neuroscientist paused for a moment and then admitted, with disarming honesty, that he had no idea. The scans were descriptive, not prescriptive. They could show the damage, but they could not, by themselves, tell us how to heal it. For van der Kolk, this moment crystallized a mission that would define the rest of his career. The insights of neuroscience were indispensable, but they were not sufficient. What was needed was a new kind of clinical practice, informed by brain science but not limited by it, that could translate these revolutionary discoveries into real, effective treatments. The rest of the book, he promises, is the story of his search for those treatments, a search that would lead him far beyond the conventional boundaries of psychiatry and into realms that many of his colleagues considered fringe or unscientific. It is a search for ways to help people not just understand their trauma, not just medicate their trauma, but genuinely recover from it, rewiring their brains and reclaiming their bodies so that they can finally live fully in the present, free from the tyranny of the past. Chapter 3: Looking into the Brain, the Neuroscience Revolution. The third chapter of The Body Keeps the Score takes the reader directly into the laboratories and brain imaging facilities where van der Kolk and his colleagues conducted groundbreaking research on the neurobiology of trauma. He begins by describing the moment when the tools of modern neuroscience first became available to trauma researchers, a development he compares to the invention of the telescope in astronomy. Suddenly, phenomena that had been matters of clinical intuition and theoretical speculation could be observed directly. One could watch the traumatized brain in the act of reliving a terrible memory and see in real time the neural signature of suffering. Van der Kolk conveys the profound sense of validation this brought to both clinicians and patients. For so long, trauma survivors, particularly those who had endured childhood abuse or domestic violence, had been told that their symptoms were exaggerated, that they should just get over it, that what they were experiencing was a sign of weakness or moral failing. The brain scans provided incontrovertible physical evidence that their suffering was real, that their brains had been fundamentally altered by their experiences, and that their inability to simply move on was not a character defect but a biological reality. The chapter centers on a series of pioneering studies that van der Kolk conducted and participated in, and he walks the reader through the methodology and findings with the clarity of a gifted teacher. The most famous of these studies involved recruiting a group of traumatized individuals and a control group of non-traumatized individuals and asking them to lie in an fMRI scanner while listening to a carefully prepared script that recounted their personal traumatic experiences. The scripts, which had been developed in collaboration with each participant, were vivid, detailed, and written in the present tense to maximize the sense of immediacy. As the participants listened to their scripts, the scanner recorded which areas of their brains received increased blood flow, indicating heightened neural activity, and which areas received decreased blood flow, indicating suppression. The results were dramatic and have since become iconic in the field of trauma research. When the traumatized individuals were exposed to their scripts, their brains did not process the experience as a memory. They processed it as a current ongoing threat. The amygdala, the brain's fear center, lit up brightly, sounding a frantic alarm. The visual cortex also showed heightened activity, consistent with the experience of flashbacks in which traumatic images return with hallucinatory vividness. But the most striking finding, and the one that van der Kolk emphasizes most heavily, was what happened in Broca's area, a region of the left frontal lobe that is central to the production of speech. In the traumatized participants, Broca's area went significantly offline. They were, quite literally, rendered speechless. Van der Kolk explores the profound implications of this finding. The deactivation of Broca's area explains a phenomenon that clinicians have observed for decades: the extraordinary difficulty that trauma survivors have in putting their experiences into words. When asked to describe what happened to them, survivors often become confused, fragmented, and emotionally overwhelmed. They may say things like, "I can't think straight," or "I don't have words for it." This is not resistance or avoidance in the psychoanalytic sense. It is a physiological reality. The part of the brain responsible for translating experience into language has been temporarily shut down by the intensity of the traumatic memory. The experience is being relived in the nonverbal, sensory, and emotional regions of the brain, the reptilian and limbic systems, while the rational linguistic regions are effectively disconnected. This finding had major implications for treatment. It suggested that therapies that rely exclusively on talking, on constructing a coherent verbal narrative of the trauma, might be fundamentally limited. If the trauma is stored in parts of the brain that are inaccessible to language, then healing might require approaches that engage these nonverbal regions more directly, through the body, through sensation, through rhythm and movement. The chapter then broadens its focus to describe the specific patterns of brain activity that characterize post-traumatic stress disorder. Van der Kolk introduces the concept of the smoke detector and the watchtower to explain the dysfunctional relationship between the amygdala and the medial prefrontal cortex in traumatized individuals. The amygdala, the smoke detector, is designed to react instantly to any potential threat, buying the body precious milliseconds to mount a survival response. In a healthy brain, the medial prefrontal cortex, the watchtower, quickly assesses the situation, and if it determines that the threat is not real, sends inhibitory signals to calm the amygdala down. You hear a loud bang. Your amygdala flinches and prepares you to run. Your prefrontal cortex notes that the bang was just a car backfiring and tells the amygdala to relax. This constant calibration allows us to navigate a world full of potential triggers without being in a perpetual state of panic. In PTSD, Van der Kolk explains, this calibration system is broken. The amygdala has become so sensitized that it fires off warnings constantly, and the medial prefrontal cortex has lost its ability to inhibit and regulate the amygdala's response. The smoke detector is shrieking and the watchtower is either asleep or overwhelmed. The result is a brain that cannot distinguish between a real threat and a harmless reminder, a brain that responds to a memory with the same full-body emergency response that it would deploy against an actual predator. Van der Kolk also discusses the role of the thalamus, a structure deep in the brain that acts as a relay station or a filter for incoming sensory information. The thalamus receives signals from the eyes, ears, skin, and other sensory organs and integrates them into a coherent, unified perception of the present moment. In healthy brains, the thalamus then passes this integrated information along to the amygdala for a quick threat assessment and to the frontal lobes for more detailed processing. In traumatized brains, Van der Kolk explains, the thalamus can become overwhelmed and break down. The unfiltered, unintegrated sensory fragments of the traumatic event, the sound of a scream, the sight of a face contorted in rage, the smell of a particular cologne are not properly processed and filed away as a coherent memory. Instead, they remain isolated, raw, and directly accessible to the amygdala. This explains why a single sensory cue, a smell or a sound, can trigger a full-blown traumatic flashback. The thalamus has failed in its integrative function, and the sensory fragments of the past continue to intrude on the present with undiminished power. The chapter concludes with Van der Kolk reflecting on the therapeutic possibilities opened up by this neuroscientific understanding. If trauma involves a dysregulation of the relationship between the emotional and rational brains, then healing must involve restoring the balance between them. Survivors need to learn how to strengthen the capacity of their medial prefrontal cortex to inhibit the amygdala's false alarms. They need to find ways to reactivate their Broca's area so that they can translate their nonverbal, sensory experiences into language and integrate them into the larger narrative of their lives, and they need to learn how to calm their overactive reptilian brains, to teach their bodies that the danger has passed and that it is safe to relax. The brain imaging studies showed that these changes were possible. Neuroplasticity, the brain's remarkable ability to rewire itself in response to experience, meant that the damage of trauma was not necessarily permanent. New connections could be formed, new pathways could be strengthened. The traumatized brain could, in effect, be retrained. But this retraining, Van der Kolk insists, could not be achieved through insight and understanding alone. The rational brain could not simply talk the emotional brain out of its terror. What was needed were methods that engaged the whole brain, methods that worked from the bottom up, starting with the body and the reptilian brain and slowly building toward emotional regulation and finally, cognitive integration. The neuroscience revolution had shown with stunning clarity what was broken in the traumatized brain. The next challenge, and the subject of the chapters to come, was to discover what could make it whole again. Chapter 4. Running for Your Life. The Anatomy of Survival, the fourth chapter of The Body Keeps the Score, shifts from the laboratory to the visceral. moment-by-moment experience of a person facing overwhelming threat, and van der Kolk begins by asking a deceptively simple question. What actually happens inside the human body and brain when survival is at stake? He wants the reader to understand, at a gut level, the cascade of physiological events that constitute the trauma response, because it is precisely this response, frozen in time and replayed endlessly, that lies at the core of post-traumatic suffering. The chapter is structured around a detailed, almost cinematic description of the body's survival systems in action. Van der Kolk draws on research from evolutionary biology, animal behavior, and human physiology to construct a narrative that is both scientifically precise and deeply empathetic. He wants us to see that the symptoms of trauma, the racing heart, the cold sweat, the tunnel vision, the inability to think clearly, are not signs of pathology. They are the perfectly orchestrated, evolutionarily honed responses of an organism doing exactly what it was designed to do when faced with a life-threatening situation. The problem for traumatized people is not that they had this response. The problem is that the response never fully turned off. Van der Kolk introduces the reader to the autonomic nervous system, ANS, the body's master regulator of arousal and calm. The ANS has two major branches, the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. The sympathetic branch is the body's accelerator, responsible for mobilizing energy and preparing the organism for action. When a threat is detected, the sympathetic nervous system floods the body with adrenaline and cortisol, increasing heart rate and blood pressure, sharpening the senses, and shunting blood flow away from non-essential functions like digestion and toward the large muscles needed for fighting or fleeing. This is the famous fight or flight response, and van der Kolk describes it in rich physiological detail. The pupils dilate to let in more light and improve vision. The bronchioles in the lungs expand to take in more oxygen. The liver releases glucose to provide a burst of energy. The muscles tense, primed for explosive movement. Even the blood itself changes, becoming thicker and more likely to clot in preparation for a potential wound. The entire organism is transformed into a single-purpose survival machine, focused with laser intensity on the immediate threat. The parasympathetic nervous system, by contrast, is the body's brake. It is responsible for calming the organism down after a threat has passed, slowing the heart, relaxing the muscles, and restoring the body to a state of rest and digest. In a healthy, well-regulated person, these two systems work in a delicate, dynamic balance, constantly adjusting arousal levels to match the demands of the environment. For a traumatized person, this balance is shattered. The sympathetic nervous system is stuck in the on position, keeping the body in a state of chronic hyperarousal. But van der Kolk emphasizes that the fight or flight response is not the only survival strategy in the body's repertoire. Drawing on the work of researchers like Stephen Porges and Jaap Panksepp, he describes a more ancient, more desperate survival response that occurs when fight or flight is impossible. When an organism is faced with an overwhelming threat from which there is no escape, when struggling is futile and resistance will only make things worse, the body deploys a last-ditch survival strategy: immobility, collapse, or playing dead. This response is mediated by a different branch of the parasympathetic nervous system, an ancient unmyelinated vagal circuit that Porges calls the dorsal vagal complex. The dorsal vagal response causes a dramatic, precipitous drop in heart rate and blood pressure. Breathing becomes shallow. The muscles go limp. The organism may faint or dissociate. In animals, this is the classic possum playing dead or the gazelle that collapses in the jaws of a predator. It is a profoundly adaptive response to inescapable threat because predators are often less interested in prey that appears to be already dead, and the collapse into limpness can sometimes allow the animal to survive an attack that it could not possibly fight off. The physical and psychological numbing that accompanies this response also serves a merciful function, blunting the experience of pain and terror as the worst unfolds. Van der Kolk argues that a great deal of what we call trauma, particularly the trauma of childhood abuse, domestic violence, and sexual assault, is rooted in this dorsal vagal collapse response. A child being beaten by a parent cannot fight back and cannot run away. The only biologically available option is to go limp, to dissociate, to send the body into a state of low metabolic activity and the mind into a state of foggy unreality. The problem is that, like the fight or flight response, this collapse response can become stuck in the on position long after the actual danger has passed. The survivor continues to live in a state of chronic shutdown, characterized by emotional numbness, physical lethargy, a sense of detachment from their own body, and an inability to engage fully with the world. Van der Kolk writes with great compassion about these survivors, who are often misunderstood and misdiagnosed. They are not simply depressed or unmotivated. Their bodies have learned at the deepest physiological level that the only safe response to stress is to disappear. They are trapped not in a state of high anxiety, but in a state of low-grade, persistent collapse. The chapter then explores the concept of the window of tolerance, a term developed by psychiatrist Dan Siegel that Van der Kolk finds clinically invaluable. The window of tolerance describes the optimal zone of arousal in which a person can function effectively, processing information, managing emotions, and engaging in relationships. Within this window, a person can experience stress and emotion without becoming overwhelmed. For traumatized individuals, the window of tolerance is extremely narrow. Slightly too much stimulation, a minor stressor, a raised voice, a sudden change in plans, and they are catapulted out of their window on the hyperarousal side into panic, rage, or overwhelming anxiety. Slightly too little stimulation, a lack of distraction, a quiet moment alone with their thoughts, and they may fall out of their window on the hypoarousal side into numbness, collapse, and dissociation. Much of the behavior that clinicians label as pathological in trauma survivors, the emotional volatility, the avoidance, the self-destructive impulsivity, can be understood as desperate, often unconscious attempts to regulate their arousal and stay within their narrow window of tolerance. A survivor might pick a fight with a partner not because they want to cause conflict, but because the adrenaline of the argument jolts them out of a state of numbing collapse. Another survivor might use alcohol or drugs to dampen the constant, unbearable hyperarousal that makes every moment feel like an emergency. These are not healthy coping strategies, Van der Kolk acknowledges, but they are coping strategies nonetheless, and understanding their physiological roots is essential for effective treatment. Van der Kolk also discusses the crucial role of the social engagement system in regulating the autonomic nervous system. Drawing again on Porges's polyvagal theory, he explains that the newest branch of the parasympathetic nervous system, the myelinated vagus, is uniquely connected to the muscles of the face, the middle ear, and the larynx. This social engagement system allows us to communicate safety and connection through facial expressions, eye contact, prosody of voice, and listening. When a person is in a state of sympathetic arousal, a calming presence, a warm smile, a soothing voice can activate the social engagement system and help bring them back into their window of tolerance. This is the physiological basis of the healing power of relationships. But for trauma survivors, the social engagement system itself has often been damaged. If the people who were supposed to provide safety and comfort were the very source of the trauma, as in childhood abuse, the survivor's brain has learned to associate human connection with danger. The very mechanisms that should help them regulate their arousal, a kind face, a comforting touch, can trigger a threat response. This is one of the deepest tragedies of interpersonal trauma. It robs people of the very thing they most need to heal, the capacity to feel safe in the presence of another human being. The chapter concludes with Van der Kolk reflecting on the implications of this physiological understanding for treatment. If trauma is rooted in a dysregulated nervous system, then healing must involve helping survivors learn to regulate their arousal, to expand their window of tolerance, and to reactivate their social engagement system. The goal of treatment, he argues, is not simply to process memories or change thoughts, though these are important. The deeper goal is to restore the body's capacity to move fluidly between states of arousal and calm, to feel safe and alive in the present moment. Survivors need to learn that they can experience intense sensations and emotions without being overwhelmed, that they can defend themselves effectively, and that they can find comfort in connection with others. This is not a process that can be accomplished through talking alone. It requires interventions that work directly with the body. Interventions that help survivors notice and tolerate their physical sensations, interventions that allow them to complete the defensive actions that were thwarted at the moment of trauma, and interventions that rebuild the capacity for safe, attuned human connection. The Anatomy of Survival is a map of what went wrong in trauma. Kolk is now ready to explore the territory of what can set it right. Chapter 5. Body-Brain Connections. The fifth chapter of The Body keeps the score delves into the intricate and often overlooked pathways through which the body and brain communicate, and Kolk begins with a fundamental assertion that challenges centuries of Western philosophical and medical tradition. The mind, he insists, is not a disembodied intellect residing exclusively in the skull. It is rooted in the entire organism, constantly receiving and sending signals to every organ, muscle, and tissue in the body. To understand trauma, one must understand this bidirectional communication system, and to heal trauma, one must learn to speak the body's language. Kolk opens the chapter with a discussion of the vagus nerve, a sprawling, meandering bundle of fibers that he describes as the body's most important information superhighway. The vagus nerve, which takes its name from the Latin word for wandering, originates in the brainstem and travels down through the neck into the chest and abdomen, branching out to connect the brain with the heart, the lungs, the stomach, the intestines, and nearly every major organ. What is crucial, Kolk explains, is that approximately 80% of the fibers in the vagus nerve are afferent, meaning they carry information from the body up to the brain, while only 20% are efferent, carrying commands from the brain down to the body. The body is not simply a passive recipient of the brain's orders. It is a vast sensory organ, constantly sending the brain a torrent of information about its internal state. The brain's primary job is not abstract thought, but the constant, moment-by-moment monitoring and regulation of the body's physiological condition, a process neuroscientists call interoception. Kolk introduces the work of Antonio Damasio, the neuroscientist whose research on consciousness and emotion profoundly shaped his understanding of the body-brain connection. Damasio's somatic marker hypothesis proposes that our emotions and our decision-making are fundamentally guided by physical sensations arising from the body. When we encounter a situation, our brain generates a representation of the body's state, a felt sense of the situation that precedes and informs conscious thought. This is the gut feeling that tells us something is wrong before we can articulate why. This is the heart-sinking sensation of dread. This is the warm, expansive feeling in the chest that accompanies joy or love. These somatic markers are not ancillary to emotion, they are emotion, or at least the raw material from which conscious emotional experience is constructed. For a person with a healthy, well-regulated nervous system, interoception provides a constant, reliable stream of information about their needs, their boundaries, and their environment. Hunger is a signal to eat. Fatigue is a signal to rest. A knot in the stomach is a signal that a situation feels unsafe. A sense of calm warmth in the presence of another person is a signal of trust and connection. This internal compass allows a person to navigate the world with a basic sense of agency and self-trust. For traumatized individuals, Kolk explains, this internal compass is shattered. The body's signals become not a source of guidance but a source of terror because the trauma has so thoroughly dysregulated the autonomic nervous system. The body is constantly sending the brain signals of extreme distress, even when the external environment is perfectly safe. The heart is always pounding or alternatively feeling heavy and dead. The stomach is perpetually in knots. The muscles are chronically tense and ready for action. For many survivors, the experience of simply being in their own body is so unpleasant, so frightening, or so overwhelming that they learn to tune out the body's signals entirely. They suppress their interoceptive awareness. They live from the neck up, disconnected from the felt sense of their physical selves. This numbing, Kolk writes, comes at a terrible cost. By shutting down their awareness of their bodies, survivors also shut down their capacity to feel joy, pleasure, and connection. They lose the ability to know what they want, what they need, and what they feel. They cannot tell when they are hungry or full, tired or restless, safe or in danger. They lose the most fundamental basis of self-knowledge and self-care. Van der Kolk describes patients who could not identify the simplest physical sensations in their bodies. Patients who, when asked what they felt in their chest or stomach, would stare at him blankly and say, "Nothing." They were not lying. They had so successfully walled themselves off from their bodies that the internal channels of communication had gone silent. A particularly important section of the chapter is devoted to the topic of alexithymia, a term derived from Greek that literally means having no words for feelings. Van der Kolk explains that alexithymia is strikingly common among trauma survivors, particularly those who endured chronic childhood abuse. Alexithymic individuals cannot identify or describe their emotions. They may experience intense physical sensations but cannot connect those sensations to emotional states. They might feel their heart racing and their palms sweating but not recognize that they are afraid. They might feel a heavy, crushing sensation in their chest but not understand that they are sad. Instead, they often experience their emotions as purely physical problems, unexplained stomach aches, chronic headaches, mysterious pains that no doctor can diagnose. Or they may act out their emotions in impulsive, destructive ways, exploding with rage or collapsing into despair without any conscious understanding of what triggered the reaction. Van der Kolk links alexithymia directly to the deactivation of the medial prefrontal cortex and Broca's area during traumatic experiences, which he discussed in earlier chapters. If the parts of the brain that integrate bodily sensations into conscious emotional experience and translate those experiences into language are offline when the trauma is occurring, the survivor never develops the neural circuitry to process their internal states in a coherent, mindful way. They're adrift in a sea of overwhelming sensations with no compass and no map. The chapter also explores the clinical implications of these body-brain disconnections. Van der Kolk describes his growing realization that effective trauma treatment needed to begin not with the story of what happened, but with the patient's relationship to their own body. Before a survivor can safely process traumatic memories, they first need to develop the capacity to notice, tolerate, and make sense of their physical sensations. They need to learn that they can feel their heart pounding without having a panic attack, that they can notice a knot in their stomach without being overwhelmed by nausea and dread. This is the foundational work of trauma recovery, and Van der Kolk calls it befriending the body. He introduces some of the body-based interventions that he would later explore in greater depth, including mindfulness practices, yoga, and sensoromotor psychotherapy. The common thread in all these approaches is teaching survivors to become curious, non-judgmental observers of their own internal experience. A survivor might be guided to notice the sensation of their feet on the floor, the rhythm of their breath moving in and out, the subtle tension in their shoulders or jaw. The goal is not to change anything, at least not at first. The goal is simply to pay attention, to re-establish the lines of communication between body and brain that were severed by trauma. Van der Kolk shares clinical anecdotes that illustrate the transformative power of this seemingly simple practice. He describes a woman who had survived a brutal sexual assault and who for years afterward had felt like she was floating above her body, watching her life from a great distance. When he first asked her to close her eyes and notice what was happening inside her, she reported a terrifying sensation of falling into a bottomless pit. But with patient, gentle guidance over many sessions, she began to discover that she could notice the falling sensation without being consumed by it. She learned that the sensation would eventually pass, that she could anchor herself by focusing on the solidity of the chair beneath her or the cool air on her skin. Slowly, she began to reclaim her body as a place of relative safety rather than a source of unending terror. This process, Van der Kolk emphasizes, is not a quick fix. It requires immense patience, courage, and the presence of a therapist or guide who can provide a sense of safety and co-regulation, but it is the necessary foundation upon which all other trauma work must be built. There can be no deep processing of traumatic memories without a body that can tolerate the sensations those memories evoke. There can be no genuine recovery without a self that is fully embodied, fully present, and fully alive. The chapter concludes with Van der Kolk reflecting on the cultural dimensions of the body-brain split. He notes that Western culture has long been suspicious of the body, privileging reason over emotion, intellect over instinct, and the mind over the flesh. This Cartesian dualism, he suggests, is not just a philosophical abstraction. It is woven into the fabric of our medical and educational systems, which treat the body as a machine to be fixed and the mind as a separate entity that can be trained through purely cognitive means. Trauma exposes the bankruptcy of this view. It shows, with brutal clarity, that the mind and body are one, that what happens to the body shapes the brain, and that the brain's primary function is to keep the body alive and safe. Healing from trauma, Kolk argues, requires a rejection of this dualism. It requires a return to an older, more integrated understanding of the human organism, an understanding that has been preserved in many non-Western healing traditions and that is now being rediscovered by the most advanced edges of Western neuroscience. The body keeps the score, but the body also offers the path to healing. Learning to listen to its signals, to respect its needs, and to restore its natural rhythms is not a supplement to trauma therapy. It is the very heart of the work. Chapter 6. Losing Your Body, Losing Yourself. The sixth chapter of The Body. Keeps the Score continues the exploration of the body-brain connection, but turns from the physiological mechanisms to the profound psychological and existential consequences of disconnection from the body. Kolk begins with a stark and haunting statement. Trauma survivors often describe feeling that they have lost their very selves. They do not feel real. The world does not feel real. They go through the motions of daily life, but there is no aliveness, no presence, no sense of inhabiting their own skin. This is not a metaphor or a poetic description of sadness. It is a specific, measurable, and profoundly disabling consequence of trauma that Kolk and other researchers have documented extensively. He introduces the reader to the concepts of depersonalization and derealization, two closely related phenomena that are endemic among trauma survivors. Depersonalization is the sensation of being detached from one's own body and mind, of watching oneself from a distance as if observing a character in a movie. A survivor might look at their own hands and feel that they do not belong to them. They might experience their own voice as coming from somewhere else. Derealization is the corresponding sensation that the external world has become unreal, foggy, or dreamlike. People and objects may appear flat, two-dimensional, or shrouded in a kind of haze. Sounds may seem muffled or distant. The world, which to a healthy person feels solid, three-dimensional, and vividly real, becomes a stage set, a simulation, a pale imitation of life. Kolk traces these experiences directly to the collapse response he described in earlier chapters. When the body's last-ditch survival mechanism, the dorsal vagal shutdown, is activated during an overwhelming and inescapable threat, the mind's experience of the event changes dramatically. Consciousness narrows. The sense of self, which depends on the continuous integration of bodily signals, begins to fragment. Pain and terror, which would otherwise be unbearable, are blunted. The survivor may feel as though they are floating above their body, watching the terrible thing that is happening from a safe distance. This is an ingenious adaptive mechanism, mercy bestowed by the nervous system on an organism facing annihilation. The problem, Kolk explains, is that for many survivors, this adaptive response becomes a chronic condition. Long after the danger has passed, the brain continues to generate the experience of unreality and detachment. The survivor remains trapped in a kind of halfway existence, neither fully present in their body, nor fully able to engage with the world. They have lost their body, and in losing their body, they have lost the ground of their very self. The chapter includes a deeply affecting discussion of the clinical challenges posed by these dissociative symptoms. Kolk describes the difficulty of working with patients who are so profoundly disconnected from their internal experience that they cannot tell you what they feel, what they want, or even, in extreme case, who they are. Traditional talk therapy, with its assumption of a coherent narrating self who can reflect on their experiences, often fails with these patients. They can talk about their trauma in a flat, emotionless, dissociated way, recounting horrific events as if they were reading a grocery list. But this talking does not heal them because the person doing the talking is not fully present. The self that experienced the trauma is buried, split off, and inaccessible to the therapeutic conversation. Kolk writes honestly about his own early failures with these patients. his frustration and his sense of helplessness as he watched them cycle through treatment after treatment without ever seeming to get better. He came to understand that the central task of therapy with dissociated patients is not to excavate traumatic memories, but to restore the capacity for present moment embodied experience. Before anything else can happen, the patient must learn to feel safe enough to come back into their body. The self must be reassembled from its scattered fragments. A significant portion of the chapter is devoted to the cutting-edge neuroscience of self-awareness. Van der Kolk describes the research on a network of brain regions called the default mode network, DMN, which is active when the brain is at rest and not focused on any particular external task. The DMN is the neurological substrate of our sense of self. It is the network that generates the ongoing internal narrative, the stream of consciousness, the feeling of being a continuous person with a past, a present, and a future. When you are daydreaming, reflecting on your life, or simply being, your DMN is hard at work weaving together memories, sensations, and plans into a coherent sense of identity. Van der Kolk explains that neuroimaging studies have shown that in traumatized individuals, particularly those with chronic histories of childhood abuse, the DMN is often profoundly disrupted. The various nodes of the network do not communicate effectively with one another. The result is a fragmented, unstable sense of self. The survivor may feel like different people at different times. They may have gaps in their memory for large swaths of their childhood. They may struggle to imagine the future because the neural network that generates a coherent sense of a self extending through time is not functioning properly. This is the neurological basis of the identity disturbance that clinicians have long observed in survivors of severe trauma. Van der Kolk also explores the phenomenon of somatic dissociation, the loss of physical sensation and coordination that often accompanies psychological dissociation. He describes patients who could not feel large areas of their bodies, patients who were clumsy and accident-prone because they had lost proprioception, the sense of where their body is in space. He describes a woman who had been sexually abused as a child and who, decades later, still could not feel anything in her pelvic region. It was as if that part of her body had gone offline, a sensory amputation that had protected her during the abuse but that now prevented her from experiencing any physical pleasure or comfort. These somatic symptoms, Van der Kolk emphasizes, are not imaginary or hysterical in the pejorative sense. They are real, neurologically mediated phenomena. The sensory and motor maps in the brain that represent the body have been altered by the trauma. The brain has learned, quite literally, to ignore signals from certain parts of the body. Reclaiming the body, then, is not just a psychological process. It is a process of neural retraining, of reactivating dormant sensory pathways and reintegrating the body's map in the brain. The chapter introduces the concept of agency as the central casualty of trauma and the central goal of recovery. Agency, Van der Kolk explains, is the felt sense of being in charge of one's own life. It is the knowledge that your actions can have an effect on the world, that you can make choices, that you can defend yourself, that you can shape your own destiny. This sense of agency is rooted in the body. It begins in infancy, when a baby learns that crying brings a caregiver, that reaching for an object can grasp it, that crawling can transport them toward something interesting or away from something unpleasant. These early sensoromotor experiences are the foundation of a lifelong sense of mastery and self-efficacy. Trauma, especially childhood trauma, destroys this foundation. The survivor learns, at a fundamental, bodily level, that they are helpless, that resistance is futile, that their actions have no effect on the outcome. This learned helplessness becomes encoded in the nervous system, and in the very posture and movement patterns of the body. Van der Kolk describes traumatized patients whose bodies seem to broadcast their inner sense of powerlessness. They walked with a caved-in posture. Their movements were tentative and constricted. They seemed to be trying to take up as little space as possible, as if constantly apologizing for their own existence. Restoring agency, Van der Kolk argues, requires not just changing thoughts, but changing the body's deeply ingrained patterns of movement, posture, and action. The chapter concludes with Van der Kolk reflecting on the implications of all this for the practice of psychotherapy. He writes that the goal of trauma treatment is not simply to help survivors remember and process the past. It is to help them reclaim their bodies, their selves, and their lives. This involves learning to be present, to feel what they feel, to know what they know, and to act on their own behalf. It involves rebuilding the damaged neural networks that support a coherent sense of self. It involves discovering, often for the first time, that it is safe to inhabit their own skin, that their bodies can be a source of pleasure and strength rather than pain and terror, and that they have the power to shape their own lives. This is a long and difficult journey, and it requires a therapeutic relationship that is itself a source of safety and co-regulation. But it is a journey that is possible, and van der Kolk insists that it is the only journey worth taking. Losing the body and losing the self is the essence of trauma. Finding them again is the essence of recovery. The chapters that follow will explore the specific methods, both ancient and modern, that can help survivors make this journey home to themselves. Chapter 7. Getting on the same wavelength. Attachment and attunement. The 7th chapter of The Body Keeps the Score shifts its focus from the internal landscape of the traumatized individual to the relational matrix in which both trauma and healing occur. Van der Kolk begins with a simple but profound truth that he has learned over decades of clinical practice. Humans are fundamentally social animals, and the most powerful source of both psychological devastation and psychological resilience is other people. The chapter is a deep exploration of attachment, the invisible, life-shaping bond that forms between infants and their primary caregivers, and that serves as the template for all subsequent relationships. Van der Kolk introduces the foundational work of John Bowlby, the British psychoanalyst and psychiatrist who, in the mid-20th century, first proposed that the infant's need for a secure attachment to a caregiver is a primary biological imperative, as essential to survival as food and water. Bowlby's radical insight was that the attachment system is not a secondary drive derived from the need for nourishment as Freud had believed, but an independent motivational system in its own right. Infants do not love their mothers because their mothers feed them. They love their mothers because evolution has programmed them to seek proximity to a protective adult, and that bond of love is itself the source of safety that allows the infant to explore the world and develop into a healthy, autonomous person. Van der Kolk then describes the ingenious experimental paradigm through which attachment was studied, the strange situation, developed by Bowlby's colleague Mary Ainsworth. In this procedure, a mother and her 1-year-old child enter an unfamiliar room filled with toys. The child is given time to explore, then a stranger enters, the mother leaves briefly, and the mother returns. The critical data is not what the child does when the mother is present, but what the child does upon reunion. Ainsworth identified 3, later expanded to 4, distinct patterns of attachment behavior. Securely attached infants, who have had caregivers that are consistently responsive and attuned to their needs, are distressed when their mother leaves but are quickly comforted upon her return. They cry, they reach for her, they are soothed by her presence, and then, remarkably, they are able to return to play. The caregiver's attuned response has restored their sense of safety, and the world is once again a place that can be explored. Avoidantly attached infants, by contrast, have learned that their caregivers are consistently unresponsive or rejecting. When their mother leaves, they show little outward distress, and when she returns, they actively ignore or avoid her. They have learned at the tender age of 1 that expressing their needs will not get them met, and so they suppress their attachment behavior and their emotional expression. Their bodies, however, tell a different story. Physiological monitoring reveals that their heart rates and cortisol levels are just as elevated as those of secure infants. They are not unbothered. They're simply hiding their distress. The 3rd pattern, anxious or ambivalent attachment, develops in response to caregivers who are inconsistent, sometimes responsive and sometimes unavailable, leaving the infant in a state of perpetual uncertainty. These infants are clingy, difficult to soothe, and angry, simultaneously desperate for contact and resistant to comfort when it is offered. They have learned that they must maximize their displays of distress to get their needs met, and even then, the relief they seek is never fully satisfying. The 4th pattern, Disorganized attachment was identified later by Mary Main and is particularly common among children who have been abused or whose caregivers are themselves severely traumatized. For these infants, the person who should be the source of safety is also the source of terror. The attachment system, which drives the child to seek proximity to the caregiver when frightened, is activated by the very person from whom the child needs protection. This creates an insoluble paradox, fear without solution. In the strained situation, these infants display bizarre, contradictory behaviors. They may freeze, rock, hit themselves, or approach the caregiver with their head averted. They have no coherent strategy for managing their distress because the biological solution, turning to the attachment figure for comfort, is also the biological threat. Van der Kolk notes that disorganized attachment is a powerful predictor of later psychopathology, including severe dissociative disorders and borderline personality disorder. The chapter then draws the crucial connection between early attachment patterns and adult trauma. Van der Kolk explains that the attachment style we develop as infants shapes the very architecture of our brains, particularly the neural systems involved in emotion regulation, stress response, and social connection. A secure attachment provides a child with an external source of regulation. When the child is distressed, the caregiver's calming presence brings the child's arousal back into the window of tolerance. Over thousands of such interactions, the child's brain internalizes this regulatory capacity. They learn, literally, to soothe themselves. The medial prefrontal cortex develops the neural connections necessary to inhibit the amygdala and modulate the stress response. Secure attachment, in other words, builds the very brain structures that trauma later damages. An avoidantly or anxiously attached child, by contrast, does not get the consistent external regulation they need, and their brains develop differently. Their stress response systems are tuned to be either chronically overactive or chronically suppressed. They do not learn to trust their own internal signals or the signals of others. They enter adulthood with a compromised capacity for emotional regulation and a deep, often unconscious, distrust of human connection. When these individuals later experience trauma, they are far more vulnerable to developing full-blown PTSD. Their brains lack the resilience that a secure foundation would have provided. And when they seek help, they find it extraordinarily difficult to trust a therapist, because their earliest experiences have taught them that other people cannot be relied upon. Van der Kolk devotes a significant portion of the chapter to the concept of attunement, the subtle, largely nonverbal dance of communication between caregiver and child, and, by extension, between therapist and patient. Attunement is the process of being on the same wavelength, of sensing another person's internal state and responding in a way that lets them know they are seen, felt, and understood. He describes the exquisite micro-interactions that researchers have documented between mothers and infants, the synchronized exchange of gazes, vocalizations, and facial expressions that occur in a rhythm as precise and beautiful as a duet. When a baby coos, the mother coos back. When the baby looks away, overwhelmed, the mother waits. When the baby looks back, the mother's face lights up with a welcoming smile. This is not a trivial game. It is the process through which the infant learns that their internal states are shareable and manageable, that they can affect another person, and that connection brings relief. This is the foundation of the sense of agency and the sense of belonging. For traumatized adults, particularly those with histories of childhood abuse or neglect, this capacity for attuned communication is often severely impaired. They may never have experienced it, or their experiences of it were so entangled with betrayal and pain that they cannot trust it. They may misread facial expressions, interpreting neutral faces as hostile. They may be unable to maintain eye contact. They may be exquisitely sensitive to the slightest hint of rejection or abandonment. The therapeutic relationship, Van der Kolk argues, must therefore become a space where the patient can experience genuine attunement, perhaps for the first time in their lives. Van der Kolk is candid about the immense difficulty of this work. He describes the visceral countertransference reactions that traumatized patients can evoke in their therapists. A patient who dissociates and goes blank may leave the therapist feeling frustrated, bored, or helpless. A patient who rages and devalues the therapist may evoke anger or a desire to retaliate. A patient who idealizes the therapist and then becomes suicidal when the therapist takes a vacation may evoke a desperate, anxious need to rescue. These reactions, van der Kolk insists, are not signs of the therapist's incompetence. They are valuable sources of information about the patient's internal world and the relational patterns they evoke in others. The therapist's task is to notice these feelings without acting on them, to stay present and attuned even when the patient is doing everything in their power, consciously or unconsciously, to push them away. This requires a deep commitment to self-awareness and self-regulation on the part of the therapist. One cannot help a patient regulate their own nervous system if one's own nervous system is dysregulated. Van der Kolk writes that this is why the best trauma therapists have often done their own deep therapeutic work and have practices such as mindfulness or yoga that help them stay grounded and present in the face of intense emotional storms. The chapter concludes with Van der Kolk reflecting on the profound implications of attachment research for how we understand and treat trauma. He writes that trauma is not just an individual disorder but a relational one. It originates, in many cases, in failures of human connection, and it perpetuates itself through the survivor's inability to find and sustain safe, attuned relationships. The healing of trauma, therefore, must also be relational. Medications can dampen symptoms. Individual skills can improve regulation. But deep, lasting recovery, Van der Kolk believes, almost always occurs in the context of relationships that provide the safety, attunement, and connection that were missing at the beginning. This is true whether the relationship is with a therapist, a partner, a support group, or a community. The brain's capacity for neuroplasticity means that new, healthier attachment patterns can be learned. The old templates can be overwritten, but this requires repeated, lived experiences of being truly seen, truly heard, and truly cared for. It requires getting on the same wavelength with another human being and discovering in that resonance that one is no longer alone. The chapters that follow will explore specific modalities of treatment, but Van der Kolk emphasizes that no technique, however powerful, can replace the healing power of a genuine human connection. The relationship is the therapy, or at the very least, it is the foundation upon which all other therapeutic work must rest. Chapter 8. Trapped in Relationships: The Cost of Abuse and Neglect. The 8th chapter of The Body Keeps the Score turns its unflinching gaze from the general principles of attachment to the specific devastating consequences of childhood abuse and neglect. Van der Kolk begins with a sobering acknowledgement that much of his earlier work focused on adult-onset trauma, particularly combat veterans, and that it took him years to fully grasp the qualitatively different and more pervasive damage wrought by trauma that occurs in childhood at the hands of the very people who are supposed to provide love and protection. He writes that the worst traumas are not the impersonal disasters of war or natural catastrophe, but the intimate betrayals that take place within the family. When a child is hurt by a parent or caregiver, the injury is not just to the body or the psyche. It is to the developing self, to the fundamental trust in the world as a safe place and in other people as sources of comfort. The chapter is an exhaustive and deeply compassionate examination of the long-term effects of childhood maltreatment, drawing on the landmark Adverse Childhood Experiences (ACEE) study, decades of developmental psychology research, and Van der Kolk's own extensive clinical experience. Van der Kolk introduces the reader to the ACE study, a massive epidemiological investigation conducted in the 1990s by Vincent Felitti and Robert Anda that transformed the medical and public health understanding of childhood trauma. The study surveyed more than 17,000 adult members of a large health maintenance organization, asking them about 10 categories of adverse childhood experiences, including physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, physical neglect, emotional neglect, parental mental illness, parental substance abuse, parental incarceration, domestic violence in the home, and parental separation or divorce. The results were staggering in their scope and implications. Adverse childhood experiences were far more common than anyone had anticipated. Nearly two-thirds of the middle-class, mostly white employed adults in the study had experienced at least one category of childhood adversity, and more than 1 in 5 had experienced 3 or more. But the truly groundbreaking finding was the dose-response relationship between childhood adversity and virtually every major negative health outcome in adulthood. The more adverse experiences a person had endured in childhood, the higher their risk for alcoholism, drug abuse, depression, suicide attempts, smoking, obesity, heart disease, cancer, liver disease, and a host of other serious conditions. The ACE score was not just a measure of psychological distress, it was a powerful predictor of physical disease and premature death. Van der Kolk explains the mechanisms underlying this startling correlation. The chronic, unpredictable stress of childhood abuse and neglect, he writes, does not just create psychological wounds, it literally reshapes the developing body and brain. A child living in a constant state of fear and hyperarousal has a stress response system that is chronically activated. Cortisol, adrenaline, and other stress hormones flood the developing tissues, disrupting the formation of neural connections, impairing the immune system, and altering the expression of genes that regulate everything from metabolism to emotional reactivity. The child's brain adapts to a world of danger by becoming hypersensitive to threat and underdeveloped in the areas responsible for self-regulation, planning, and reflective thought. The child's body adapts by maintaining a state of high metabolic alert, storing fat differently, and setting the thermostat of the stress response to a permanent high. These adaptations are not signs of pathology. They are brilliant, life-preserving responses to a toxic environment, but they come at a terrible long-term cost. The survival strategies that protect a child in an abusive home become the sources of disease, dysfunction, and despair in adulthood. The hypervigilance becomes chronic anxiety. The emotional numbing becomes depression. The chronic stress becomes heart disease and autoimmune disorders. The child survives the family, but the adult pays the price. A particularly harrowing section of the chapter is devoted to the specific effects of different types of childhood maltreatment. Van der Kolk discusses the legacy of physical abuse, which teaches a child that their body is not their own, that pain is a normal part of intimate relationships, and that the people who love you are also the people who hurt you. He describes the long-term consequences of sexual abuse, which are uniquely devastating to the developing sense of self, sexuality, and trust. Survivors of childhood sexual abuse often struggle for decades with profound shame, dissociative symptoms, self-destructive behaviors, and an inability to experience physical intimacy as safe and pleasurable. He discusses emotional abuse and neglect, which are less visible than physical or sexual abuse, but no less damaging. Children who are constantly criticized, belittled, ignored, or made to feel worthless internalize a deep sense of being fundamentally defective and unlovable. They grow up believing, at a level that is preverbal and inaccessible to rational argument, that they do not deserve to exist, that their needs are a burden, and that they are, at their core, bad. Van der Kolk notes that emotional abuse and neglect are often the most difficult forms of trauma to treat because the damage is so deeply woven into the fabric of the person's identity. A patient who was physically abused can sometimes come to see that the abuse was wrong and that they did not deserve it. A patient who was emotionally starved from infancy often has no framework for understanding what they missed and no language for the pervasive sense of emptiness and worthlessness that haunts them. Van der Kolk then explores the relational patterns that survivors of childhood abuse and neglect often recreate in their adult lives, a phenomenon he calls the compulsion to repeat. He describes patients who were drawn, again and again, into relationships with partners who were abusive, controlling, or emotionally unavailable. This is not, he emphasizes, a sign of masochism or a failure of judgment. It is the inexorable pull of the familiar. The brain is wired to seek what it knows. For a child who grew up in an abusive home, love and pain, intimacy and danger are neurologically linked. The neural networks that encode attachment are also the networks that encode threat. The result is that, in adulthood, the survivor is unconsciously attracted to people and situations that recreate the dynamics of their childhood, not because they want to suffer, but because those dynamics feel like home. The drama and unpredictability of a chaotic relationship can feel more alive and more real than the calm stability of a healthy partnership. The survivor may be terrified of abandonment but also terrified of true intimacy because intimacy was always the precursor to betrayal. They are trapped in a relational labyrinth from which escape seems impossible. The chapter also addresses the profound impact of childhood trauma on the sense of self and the capacity for self-care. Van der Kolk describes patients who had no idea what they felt, what they wanted, or what they needed, because their entire childhood had been organized around the needs and moods of their abusive or neglectful caregivers. They had learned, as a matter of survival, to monitor the emotional state of their parents with exquisite precision, to anticipate explosions of rage or episodes of withdrawal, and to suppress their own needs entirely. In adulthood, they continued to be exquisitely attuned to the needs of others while remaining completely disconnected from their own internal signals. They could not tell when they were hungry or full, tired or restless, comfortable or in pain. They often neglected their own health, ignored warning signs of illness, and engaged in patterns of self-harm or self-sabotage that baffled their loved ones and their doctors. Van der Kolk argues that this is not a failure of will or a lack of information about healthy living. It is a direct consequence of having been trained from earliest childhood that one's own body and one's own needs do not matter. The chapter concludes with Van der Kolk reflecting on the clinical implications of this understanding. He writes that treating survivors of childhood abuse and neglect requires a fundamentally different approach than treating adults who were traumatized in adulthood. The adult-onset trauma survivor has at least a pre-trauma self to which they can hope to return. The childhood trauma survivor has no such self. They must, in effect, build a self from scratch. This is a much longer, more complex, and more delicate process. It requires creating a therapeutic relationship of absolute safety and consistency, a relationship that can serve as the secure base the patient never had. It requires teaching the patient, often for the first time, to notice and name their internal states, to recognize their needs, and to practice self-care. It requires helping the patient grieve the childhood they never had and the parent they never had, a grief that is often buried under layers of rage, shame, and denial, and it requires immense patience on the part of both therapist and patient, because the old patterns are deeply entrenched and progress is often slow, non-linear, and punctuated by periods of apparent regression. Van der Kolk ends the chapter on a note of cautious hope. The brain's capacity for neuroplasticity, he reminds the reader, extends throughout the lifespan. New neural pathways can be forged. New relational templates can be learned. The legacy of childhood abuse and neglect is not destiny, but overcoming that legacy requires a comprehensive approach that engages the body, the brain, and the relational self, an approach that the rest of the book will explore in detail. Chapter 9. What's Love Got to Do with It? The 9th chapter of The Body Keeps the Score takes its title from the Tina Turner song, and Van der Kolk uses this cultural touchstone to launch into a profound exploration of the tangled, often destructive relationship between early trauma and adult love. He begins with a clinical observation that has haunted him throughout his career. So many of his patients, particularly those with histories of childhood abuse and neglect, seem unable to disentangle love from pain. They fall in love with people who hurt them. They stay in relationships that are dangerous, demeaning, or deadening. They flee from partners who are kind, stable, and available. To an outside observer, their choices appear baffling, even insane. But Van der Kolk insists that these choices are not insane. They are the logical, if tragic expression of a nervous system that was shaped by early experiences of betrayal, terror, and abandonment. The chapter is an attempt to understand this logic, to trace the neural and physiological pathways through which childhood trauma distorts the capacity for love, and to offer a vision of what healing might look like. Van der Kolk opens the chapter by revisiting the foundational attachment research he introduced earlier, but now he applies it specifically to the domain of adult romantic relationships. He explains that the attachment patterns we develop as infants do not disappear as we grow up. They become internal working models, unconscious templates that shape how we perceive our partners, how we interpret their behavior, and how we respond to intimacy, conflict, and separation. A securely attached adult can trust that their partner will be there when needed, can tolerate the inevitable ruptures and repairs of a long-term relationship, and can maintain a balance between intimacy and autonomy. An avoidantly attached adult, by contrast, has learned that depending on others is dangerous. They keep their partners at arm's length, dismiss or suppress their own emotional needs, and often feel suffocated by intimacy. They may be drawn to partners who demand closeness, only to push them away when the partner gets too near, confirming their internal model that relationships are ultimately disappointing and that it is safer to be alone. An anxiously attached adult has learned that love is unreliable and must be constantly pursued and secured. They cling to their partners, demand constant reassurance, and are exquisitely sensitive to any sign of withdrawal or rejection. Their internal model tells them that they are not inherently lovable and that they must work desperately to keep their partner's attention, a pattern that often drives partners away, thus confirming the anxious person's deepest fears. These dynamics, van der Kolk notes, are not intellectual beliefs that can be corrected through rational argument. They are visceral, automatic, and deeply encoded in the neural circuits that govern attachment and threat. For survivors of severe childhood abuse and neglect, these attachment patterns are further complicated by the presence of what van der Kolk calls the trauma bond, the intense, almost addictive attachment that can form between an abused child and an abusive caregiver. He explains that when a child is hurt by the person they depend on for survival, the brain's attachment and threat systems become fused. The person who triggers terror is also the person who is supposed to provide comfort. The child cannot flee, cannot fight, and cannot afford to lose the caregiver's love, however distorted that love may be. The child learns instead to dissociate from the terror and to cling to whatever moments of affection or attention are available. The neurological result is that the neurochemicals of attachment, oxytocin, and endogenous opioids become linked with the neurochemicals of fear and pain. Love becomes inseparable from suffering. In adulthood, this plays out as a powerful, often overwhelming attraction to partners who recreate the dynamics of the abusive caregiver. The survivor may be consciously seeking a kind, loving partner, but their nervous system is only aroused and engaged by someone who is unpredictable, controlling, or even dangerous. A kind, stable partner feels boring, uninteresting, or, paradoxically, unsafe. The survivor's nervous system, tuned to a world of danger, does not trust calm. It only recognizes as real the intense, traumatic, painful dynamics that it was trained to navigate in childhood. Van der Kolk devotes a significant portion of the chapter to the neurobiology of this trauma bond. He describes the role of dopamine, the neurotransmitter of reward and motivation, in cementing the attachment to abusive partners. When a relationship is unpredictable, when the abusive partner oscillates between cruelty and kindness, rejection and affection, the brain's dopamine system is powerfully activated. The intermittent reinforcement schedule, the never knowing when the next bit of love might be forthcoming, creates a compulsive, addictive pull that is neurologically similar to a gambling addiction. The survivor is not just emotionally attached to the partner, they are biochemically hooked. He also discusses the role of endogenous opioids, the brain's natural painkillers, which are released during moments of reunion and reconciliation after a fight. The cycle of terror and relief, pain and comfort, becomes its own kind of drug. The survivor and the abuser are locked in a neurochemical dance that is extraordinarily difficult to break, not because the survivor is weak or foolish, but because their brain has been literally rewired by early trauma to equate this dance with love. The chapter also addresses the profound impact of childhood trauma on the capacity for sexual intimacy. Van der Kolk writes with sensitivity and candor about the sexual difficulties that so many survivors face. For some, particularly those who were sexually abused, sexual touch is a trigger for flashbacks, panic, and dissociation. The body that should be a source of pleasure becomes a minefield of traumatic memory. For others, sex becomes compulsively dissociated from emotional connection. They may engage in promiscuous or high-risk sexual behavior not because they desire sex, but because they're seeking something else. A brief physical experience of being wanted, a jolt of adrenaline that cuts through the numbness, a reenactment of the abuse that they are trying unconsciously to master. For still others, the capacity for genuine, embodied, intimate sexual connection simply never developed. They may be able to go through the motions of sex, but they are not fully present. They are watching from a distance, performing, disconnected from their own sensations and from their partner. Van der Kolk notes that these sexual difficulties are often a source of deep shame for survivors. They feel broken, defective, and unworthy of love. The therapeutic task, he argues, is to help survivors understand that these patterns are not personal failings, but the direct consequences of what was done to them, and that healing is possible. Van der Kolk then turns to the question of what healing in the domain of love actually looks like. He is honest about the difficulty of this work. It is one thing to help a patient learn to regulate their arousal in the therapist's office or to process a traumatic memory. It is quite another to help them transform their most intimate relational patterns that are wired into the deepest structures of their brains and that are replayed in the most vulnerable moments of their lives. Healing, he suggests, requires a two-pronged approach. First, the survivor must learn, in the safety of a therapeutic relationship, to recognize their own attachment patterns and to develop the capacity for self-regulation. They must learn to notice the visceral pull toward a familiar destructive dynamic and to pause, to breathe, to ground themselves in their body rather than acting automatically on the impulse. They must learn, often for the first time, what it feels like to be in a relationship, the therapeutic relationship where their needs are respected, their boundaries are honored, and their authentic self is seen and valued. This experience of a safe, attuned relationship is itself a form of neural rewiring. It creates a new template for what love can be. Second, the survivor must gradually practice these new relational skills in their life outside of therapy. This might involve learning to choose partners who are kind and stable, even if those partners initially feel boring or unfamiliar. It might involve learning to communicate needs and boundaries clearly, even when the fear of abandonment is screaming that any assertion will lead to rejection. It might involve learning to tolerate the vulnerability of genuine intimacy, the terrifying but ultimately liberating experience of being truly seen by another person. The chapter concludes with Van der Kolk reflecting on the broader cultural implications of this understanding. He notes that our society often romanticizes the kind of intense, dramatic, possessive love that is in reality a symptom of trauma bonding. Our movies, our music, our novels are filled with stories of love that is all-consuming, painful, and obsessive. He suggests that this cultural idealization of traumatic love serves to normalize and obscure the real damage that childhood abuse and neglect inflicts on the capacity for genuine connection. Real love, he argues, is not a state of perpetual drama and desperate longing. It is a state of calm, steady, mutual attunement. It is the felt sense of being safe with another person, of being able to rest in their presence, of knowing that one's needs and boundaries will be respected. This kind of love may not make for compelling cinema, but it is the foundation of a healthy life. For trauma survivors, learning to recognize, seek, and sustain this kind of love is a monumental achievement, an act of profound courage and healing. The body keeps the score of early relational wounds, but the body, and the brain that inhabits it, can also learn a new score. It can learn the rhythms of safety, attunement, and genuine life-giving love. This is the ultimate prize of the long, difficult work of trauma recovery. Chapter 10. Developmental Trauma, the Hidden Epidemic. The 10th chapter of The Body Keeps the Score represents a culmination of the themes Van der Kolk has been building throughout the book and also serves as a passionate, urgent call for a fundamental shift in how the psychiatric profession understands and diagnoses the suffering of traumatized children. He begins by stating that the current diagnostic system, embodied in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, has failed millions of children and adults whose core problem is not a discrete mental illness, but the pervasive multi-system damage caused by chronic childhood trauma. The DSM, he argues, is a taxonomy of surface symptoms. It gives us labels like depression, anxiety, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, oppositional defiant disorder, bipolar disorder, and borderline personality disorder, each with its own checklist of criteria and its own recommended medication regimen. But these labels, van der Kolk insists, obscure more than they reveal. They slice the unitary phenomenon of developmental trauma into fragments, each of which is then treated as a separate, unrelated pathology. A child who is hypervigilant, emotionally volatile, aggressive, unable to concentrate, and struggling in school may receive 5 different diagnoses and 5 different medications when the root cause of all these symptoms is a single, devastating reality. The child has grown up in an environment of chronic fear, unpredictability, and abuse, and their brain and body have adapted accordingly. The chapter is an extended argument for the creation of a new diagnosis, developmental trauma disorder, that would capture the full scope of what happens to children who are victimized at the hands of their caregivers. Van der Kolk begins by documenting the overwhelming evidence for the existence of this hidden epidemic. He cites the ACE study, which he discussed in a previous chapter, and notes that the prevalence of childhood adversity in the general population is vastly higher than most people, including most mental health professionals, realize. He then describes the specific constellation of symptoms that he and his colleagues have observed in thousands of traumatized children, and that they have proposed as the diagnostic criteria for developmental trauma disorder. These symptoms cut across multiple domains of functioning and cannot be captured by any existing diagnosis. The first domain is affect and impulse dysregulation. These children cannot manage their emotions. They fly into rages over minor frustrations, collapse into despair, or oscillate wildly between these extremes. They are impulsive, unable to think before they act, and they often engage in self-destructive behaviors such as cutting, substance abuse, or reckless risk-taking. The second domain is disturbances of attention and consciousness. They dissociate, they space out, they lose time, they have trouble concentrating on anything, and they are often misdiagnosed with ADHD, but unlike children with pure ADHD, their attention problems are rooted not in a primary neurological deficit, but in a nervous system that is perpetually scanning the environment for threats and cannot afford to focus on a math worksheet. The third domain is disturbances in self-perception. These children have a deeply held, pervasive sense of being damaged, unlovable, and fundamentally different from other people. They feel that they do not belong in the human community. They may feel that they have no future, that they will not live to be adults. The fourth domain of symptoms involves disturbances in relationships. Traumatized children, Van der Kolk explains, have profound difficulties with trust and intimacy. They may be desperately clingy and unable to tolerate even brief separations, or they may be walled off, suspicious, and unable to accept comfort. They often replay their abusive relationships, casting themselves in the role of victim or perpetrator, because these are the only relational scripts they know. The fifth domain is somatization, the expression of psychological distress through physical symptoms. These children have chronic headaches, stomach aches, and unexplained pains. Their bodies, kept in a state of chronic hyperarousal, break down in multiple ways. The sixth domain is disturbances in systems of meaning. They struggle with hopelessness, despair, and a loss of any sustaining beliefs or values. They may feel that the world is a fundamentally evil place, that they are cursed, or that life has no purpose. Van der Kolk argues that when all these symptoms are present in a single child, and when the child's history includes chronic interpersonal trauma, it is a profound distortion to label them with 5 or 6 separate comorbid disorders. They do not have many separate illnesses. They have one unified syndrome, developmental trauma disorder. The chapter includes a searing critique of the current mental health system's response to these children. Van der Kolk describes the typical trajectory of a severely traumatized child through the psychiatric mill. The child acts out in school. They are disruptive, aggressive, or completely withdrawn. The school demands that the parents do something. The child is taken to a pediatrician or a psychiatrist, who conducts a brief evaluation and prescribes a stimulant for the attention problems. The stimulant helps a little, but also makes the child more irritable and anxious. An antidepressant is added to address the mood swings. The child continues to struggle. A mood stabilizer is added. Then an antipsychotic for the aggression. Before long, the child is on a cocktail of 4 or 5 powerful psychotropic medications, none of which were ever tested in combination, and none of which address the underlying cause of the child's suffering. The child is sedated, dulled, and chemically restrained, but they are not healed. Meanwhile, van der Kolk writes, no one is addressing the environment that created the problem in the first place. No one is providing the child and their family with the intensive relational trauma-focused therapy that could actually make a difference. The medications manage the symptoms, and the system moves on to the next crisis. Van der Kolk then shares the story of his and his colleagues' efforts to get developmental trauma disorder officially recognized by the American Psychiatric Association for inclusion in the DSM-5. This section reads as a dispiriting chronicle of scientific evidence colliding with institutional inertia, and van der Kolk suspects the powerful influence of the pharmaceutical industry. He describes the meticulous research that went into the proposed diagnosis, the field trials that demonstrated its validity and reliability, and the overwhelming support it received from frontline clinicians who recognized the syndrome immediately in their patients. He then describes the political machinations that resulted in the proposal being rejected. The official reasons were that the diagnosis was not sufficiently distinct from existing disorders and that more research was needed. Van der Kolk finds these objections disingenuous. Developmental trauma disorder, he argues, is far more distinct and clinically useful than many diagnoses that were included in the DSM. And no amount of additional research will ever overcome the fundamental problem that the DSM's atomized, symptom-based approach is conceptually incapable of capturing the unified nature of developmental trauma. He suspects, though he cannot prove, that the pharmaceutical industry lobbied against the diagnosis because it would have undermined the rationale for the multi-drug regimens that generate billions of dollars in revenue. If a child's problems are understood as stemming from a history of abuse and neglect rather than from a collection of separate brain diseases, the logic of prescribing a different pill for each symptom collapses. The chapter concludes with van der Kolk reflecting on what a trauma-informed system of care would look like. He argues that the first and most important step is to ask not, "What is wrong with you?" but, "What happened to you?" This simple shift in framing changes everything. It transforms the patient from a collection of symptoms and disorders into a person with a history, a person whose current struggles are intelligible responses to overwhelming experiences. It opens the door to treatments that address root causes rather than just suppressing surface manifestations. A trauma-informed system, he writes, would invest heavily in early intervention, identifying at-risk children and families, and providing the support, education, and therapy needed to break the cycle of intergenerational trauma. It would train teachers, pediatricians, social workers, and judges to recognize the signs of developmental trauma and to respond with compassion and appropriate referrals, rather than with punishment and pathologization. It would shift resources away from the endless prescription of medications and toward the provision of evidence-based, body-oriented relational therapies. And it would create environments in schools, in foster care, in juvenile justice facilities that are genuinely safe and that provide the attuned, consistent relationships that traumatized children need to heal. Van der Kolk ends the chapter with a note of determined hope. The scientific evidence is clear. The need is enormous. The treatments exist. What is lacking is the political will and the institutional courage to fundamentally rethink how we care for our most vulnerable children. The hidden epidemic of developmental trauma will only be addressed when we, as a society, are willing to see it, to name it, and to do what is necessary to heal it. Chapter 11. Uncovering Secrets, the Problem of Traumatic Memory. The 11th chapter of The Body Keeps the Score delves into one of the most controversial and clinically crucial topics in the entire field of trauma studies, the nature of traumatic memory itself. Van der Kolk begins by stating that the memory wars of the 1980s and 1990s, the fierce public and professional debates over recovered memories of childhood sexual abuse were, for all their acrimony and destructiveness, a symptom of a deeper and more fundamental problem. Psychiatry and psychology lacked, and to a large extent still lack, a coherent, scientifically grounded understanding of how traumatic memories are encoded, stored, and retrieved. The standard model of memory, derived from laboratory studies of normal subjects learning lists of words or pairs of nonsense syllables, proved utterly inadequate to explain the bizarre, fragmented sensory, and deeply embodied nature of traumatic recall. Kolk opens the chapter by describing the clinical phenomena that any adequate theory of traumatic memory must account for. Traumatized people may remember their experiences with a vivid and hallucinatory intensity that feels like reliving the event in the present tense. They may conversely have huge gaps in their autobiographical memory, losing entire swaths of their childhood or being unable to recall the central details of a traumatic event that they know happened. A single sensory cue, a smell, a sound, a particular quality of light can trigger a full-blown flashback, while the survivor remains unable to voluntarily summon a coherent narrative of what happened. These phenomena, Kolk argues, are not mysterious or inexplicable. They are the direct consequence of how the brain processes overwhelming experiences. Kolk provides a detailed, accessible explanation of the neuroscience of memory formation, drawing a crucial distinction between two memory systems that are often conflated. The first is the explicit or declarative memory system, which is responsible for the conscious recollection of facts and events. This system is mediated by the hippocampus and the prefrontal cortex, and it allows us to place our experiences in a temporal and spatial context. When you remember what you had for breakfast this morning or where you went on vacation last summer, you are using your explicit memory system. You know that the memory belongs to the past, that it happened to you, and that it is over. The second is the implicit or non-declarative memory system, which operates below the level of conscious awareness and stores learned skills, habits, emotional responses, and conditioned physical reactions. This system is mediated by structures such as the amygdala, the basal ganglia, and the body itself. When you ride a bicycle, you are drawing on implicit memory. When you feel inexplicably anxious at the sight of a certain type of dog because you were bitten by a similar dog years ago, even if you have no conscious recollection of the bite, you are experiencing an implicit memory. Kolk explains that these two memory systems normally work in concert. An experience is initially processed by the implicit sensory and emotional systems, and then, over time, the hippocampus integrates the fragments into a coherent, explicit autobiographical narrative. The raw sensory data and the intense emotions of the moment are gradually bound into a story that is filed in the past tense. Trauma, Kolk explains, derails this normal integrative process. When an experience is overwhelmingly intense, when the body is flooded with stress hormones and the brain's threat detection systems are operating at maximum capacity, the hippocampus's ability to perform its integrative function is profoundly impaired. The traumatic experience is not processed and filed as a coherent narrative. Instead, it is encoded as a collection of fragmented, sensory, and emotional imprints that are stored in the implicit memory system, disconnected from their temporal and spatial context. The amygdala, the thalamus, and the body itself retain the raw, unprocessed data of the trauma. The sound of a voice, the smell of a particular cologne, the physical sensation of being restrained, the overwhelming feeling of terror. These fragments are not bound together into a story, and they are not stamped with a date. They exist in a kind of timeless present, waiting to be triggered by any reminder of the original event. When a trigger occurs, the implicit memory is reactivated in its full, sensory, present tense intensity. The survivor does not remember the trauma. They relive it. They are not thinking about being raped. They feel the weight of the body on top of them, smell the alcohol on the breath, and experience the same paralyzing terror they felt at the moment of the assault. The explicit memory system, which could provide the context that this is a memory and not a current reality, is offline. The survivor is neurologically back in the trauma. This understanding, Kolk argues, resolves many of the paradoxes that fueled the memory wars. Traumatic memories can be exquisitely accurate in their sensory and emotional details, while being completely fragmented and disorganized in their narrative structure. A survivor may vividly remember the pattern of the wallpaper in the room where she was abused but be unable to say how old she was, what time of year it was, or even, in some cases, who the abuser was. The sensory fragments are encoded with high fidelity by the amygdala and the sensory cortices. The narrative context, which requires the hippocampus and the prefrontal cortex, was never properly encoded. Traumatic memories can also be forgotten and then later remembered, a phenomenon that was at the center of the recovered memory controversy. Van der Kolk explains that there are multiple, well-documented mechanisms through which this can occur. The fragmented, unintegrated nature of traumatic memories makes them vulnerable to being dissociated, walled off from conscious awareness, especially in children who have learned to survive by compartmentalizing their experiences. The memories may only surface when a later event, a similar sensory cue, or a period of relative safety, such as entering a supportive adult relationship, creates the conditions for the fragments to be reassembled into consciousness. This is not the creation of false memories through suggestion, though Van der Kolk acknowledges that suggestion and leading therapeutic techniques can in some cases create false recollections. It is the recovery of genuine, previously dissociated memory fragments that are finally being integrated. Van der Kolk devotes a significant portion of the chapter to a nuanced discussion of the problem of false memories and therapist suggestion. He acknowledges that the field of trauma therapy was roiled by cases in which therapists, driven by a misguided zeal to uncover hidden abuse, used hypnosis, guided imagery, and suggestive questioning to implant memories of events that never happened. These cases were tragic for all involved, and they damaged the credibility of genuine trauma survivors. Van der Kolk is clear that therapists must be extremely careful not to impose their own expectations on patients and not to treat any emerging memory as literal, forensic truth. The goal of trauma therapy, he insists, is not to excavate a definitive historical record. It is to help the patient integrate the fragmented sensory and emotional imprints that are causing suffering in the present, whether or not they can be assembled into coherent narrative with a clear beginning, middle, and end. The body keeps the score. The implicit memories are real and are causing real symptoms. The therapeutic task is to help the patient notice these implicit memories as they arise in the body, to tolerate the associated sensations and emotions, and to gradually piece together, as much as possible and without pressure, a narrative that makes sense of their experience. This is a delicate, collaborative process that requires immense patience and a willingness to tolerate uncertainty. The chapter concludes with Van der Kolk reflecting on what this understanding of traumatic memory means for the process of healing. He writes that simply telling the story of the trauma, the traditional goal of talk therapy, is often not enough and can sometimes be re-traumatizing. The story is a product of the explicit memory system. The traumatic imprints are stored in the implicit system, in the body and the emotional brain. To heal, the survivor must find ways to access and process these implicit memories directly. This is why body-oriented therapies, such as sensorimotor psychotherapy and EMDR, can be so powerful. They provide a way to work with the traumatic imprints at the level at which they are stored, without necessarily requiring a complete verbal narrative. They help the survivor notice the physical sensations, the movements, the postures, and the emotions that are the living residue of the trauma, and they provide tools for discharging the trapped survival energy and integrating the fragments into a coherent sense of self. Van der Kolk ends the chapter by emphasizing that uncovering the secrets of the past is not an end in itself. The goal is not to remember for the sake of remembering. The goal is to help the survivor reclaim their life, their body, and their capacity for presence, connection, and joy. The traumatic memories have been running the show from the shadows, keeping the survivor stuck in a past that never ended. By bringing these memories into the light, by integrating the fragments into a coherent whole, the survivor can finally begin to live in the present. The past becomes the past. The body can finally relax its guard. The self can finally come home. Chapter 12. The unbearable heaviness of remembering, the 12th chapter of The Body Keeps the Score continues the exploration of traumatic memory, but shifts from the neurological mechanisms to the lived emotional experience of confronting one's darkest memories. Van der Kolk begins with a simple, devastating observation. Most people, including most therapists, vastly underestimate how difficult it is for trauma survivors to face what happened to them. There is a naive assumption, perpetuated by popular culture and by certain schools of therapy, that remembering and talking about trauma is inherently cathartic, that getting the story out will bring relief. For many survivors, van der Kolk writes, the opposite is true. Remembering is not a release. It is a descent into hell. The memories are not filed safely in the past. They are alive, present, and overwhelming. To remember is to relive, and to relive is to be re-traumatized. The chapter is a meditation on why the process of remembering is so unbearably heavy, why so many survivors avoid it at all costs, and what is required, both internally and interpersonally, to make the weight of memory bearable enough that healing can occur. Van der Kolk opens by describing the phenomenon of the doubled reality that traumatized people often inhabit. On the surface, they may be functioning adults, going to work, raising children, maintaining relationships. But just beneath the surface of ordinary consciousness, there is a parallel secret world of terror and pain. The survivor may be sitting in a business meeting, but a part of their brain is still in the bedroom where they were abused as a child. They may be playing with their children in the park, but their body is still braced for the next explosion of parental rage. This split consciousness is exhausting. It consumes enormous amounts of energy to keep the traumatic reality at bay, to maintain the facade of normalcy. Many survivors develop elaborate strategies for avoiding anything that might trigger the memories. They may avoid certain places, certain people, certain types of physical sensation, certain topics of conversation. They may keep themselves constantly busy, filling every moment with a work, entertainment, or activity, because silence and stillness allow the memories to surface. They may use alcohol, drugs, or food to numb the constant, low-grade sense of dread. These avoidance strategies, van der Kolk emphasizes, are not signs of weakness or lack of motivation to heal. They are desperate and often necessary survival mechanisms. The survivor is not avoiding healing. They are avoiding annihilation. The chapter then explores the specific emotional states that accompany the recall of traumatic memories and that make the process so agonizing. The first and most obvious is fear. The memory of a life-threatening event brings with it the full physiological terror response that was part of the original experience. The heart pounds, the breath shortens, the body prepares for fight or flight, even though there is no current danger. This is a terrifying, disorienting experience that can feel like dying. The second is shame, which van der Kolk identifies as perhaps the most toxic and pervasive emotion in the aftermath of trauma, particularly interpersonal trauma. Shame is not the same as guilt. Guilt is the feeling that one has done something bad. Shame is the feeling that one is something bad. Survivors of abuse, particularly childhood abuse, almost universally carry a deep wordless conviction that they are fundamentally defective, dirty, and unworthy of love. They may intellectually understand that the abuse was not their fault, but at a visceral bodily level, they feel that they must have deserved it, that they brought it on themselves, that there is something about them that invited the horror. This shame is activated with overwhelming force when the traumatic memories surface. To remember the abuse is not just to remember a terrible event. It is to be plunged back into the state of being a worthless, helpless, degraded object. The survivor will do almost anything to avoid this feeling. The third emotional state that accompanies traumatic remembering is grief. Van der Kolk writes that beneath the fear and the shame, there's often a vast, untouched ocean of grief. Grief for the childhood that was stolen. Grief for the person one might have become if the trauma had not occurred. Grief for the trust and innocence that can never be recovered. Grief for the years of life lost to depression, addiction, and dysfunctional relationships. This grief is not a clean, linear process. It is a tangled, messy, and overwhelming flood of sadness, rage, and longing. Many survivors fear that if they allow themselves to begin grieving, they will never stop. The grief feels bottomless, and the prospect of falling into it is terrifying. The fourth emotional state is rage, often a murderous, annihilating rage directed at the perpetrator, at the bystanders who did not protect, at the world for being so cruel, and at oneself for being so helpless. This rage can be as terrifying as the fear, because the survivor may feel that if they ever truly access their anger, they will lose control completely and destroy themselves or someone else. The combination of these four emotional states, fear, shame, grief, and rage, creates a cauldron of suffering that makes the act of remembering feel like a descent into madness. It is no wonder, van der Kolk writes, that survivors resist it with every fiber of their being. Van der Kolk then discusses the clinical implications of this understanding. He argues that the central task of trauma therapy is not to force the survivor to remember and recount the details of their trauma. The central task is to create the conditions in which remembering becomes bearable. This requires, first and foremost, a therapeutic relationship of profound safety and trust. The survivor must feel, at a gut level, that the therapist can handle whatever emerges, that the therapist will not be overwhelmed, disgusted, or driven away by the intensity of the survivor's emotions. This is not a matter of the therapist saying reassuring words. It is a matter of the therapist's actual, embodied presence. The therapist must be able to stay calm, grounded, and attuned even as the survivor is in the grip of terror, shame, or rage. The therapist's regulated nervous system serves as an external source of regulation for the survivor's dysregulated nervous system. This is the essence of the co-regulation that van der Kolk discussed in the chapter on attachment. The survivor cannot regulate themselves alone. They need the presence of another human being who can provide the safety and calm that they cannot yet provide for themselves. Second, the survivor must develop the capacity for what van der Kolk calls dual awareness, the ability to simultaneously hold the reality of the traumatic memory and the reality of the present moment. This is the opposite of the reliving experience, in which the survivor is completely consumed by the past and loses all contact with the present. Dual awareness is the ability to say or to feel, "I am remembering being raped. It is terrifying. My body is reacting as if it is happening now, and I am also sitting in a chair in my therapist's office. I am safe. This is a memory. It is not happening now." This capacity is not something that survivors can simply will themselves to have. It is a skill that must be developed gradually, through practices like mindfulness, grounding exercises, and body awareness training. The survivor learns to notice the sensations and emotions of the traumatic memory while also staying connected to the felt sense of their feet on the floor, their breath moving in and out, the solid presence of the therapist across from them. This dual awareness is the neurological foundation of integration. It allows the prefrontal cortex to stay online and to provide the context that the amygdala, in its panic, cannot provide. It transforms reliving into remembering. Third, the process of remembering must be carefully titrated. Van der Kolk uses the metaphor of a pendulum, or a wave. The survivor must learn to approach the traumatic memory, to touch it, to feel the associated sensations and emotions, and then to move away from it, to return to a state of calm and safety. This process of pendulation prevents the survivor from becoming overwhelmed and re-traumatized. It allows the nervous system to learn, through repeated experience, that it can tolerate the activation and then return to baseline. Over time, the intensity of the traumatic memory diminishes. The body learns that the danger has passed. The memory becomes a coherent past tense narrative rather than a present tense reliving. This is slow, painstaking work that cannot be rushed. The therapist must be exquisitely attuned to the survivor's state, noticing the subtle signs of hyperarousal or dissociation and intervening to help the survivor regulate before they become overwhelmed. This requires a deep understanding of the body's language, a topic van der Kolk has been building toward throughout the book. The chapter concludes with van der Kolk reflecting on the courage required to do this work. He writes that he has been continually humbled by the bravery of his patients, who are willing to face the unbearable heaviness of their memories in the hope of reclaiming their lives. He also notes that not all remembering needs to be explicit. Some survivors may never be able, or may never need, to construct a complete verbal narrative of their trauma. The implicit bodily memories can be processed and integrated without ever being fully translated into words. The goal is not a perfect historical account. The goal is the restoration of aliveness, presence, and connection. If the survivor can feel safe in their own body, can experience joy and pleasure, can form and sustain loving relationships, and can live fully in the present moment, then the work of remembering has served its purpose. The unbearable heaviness has been lifted, not by forgetting, but by integrating the memory into the larger story of a life that is no longer defined by trauma. The past has become the past, and the future is once again a horizon of possibility, rather than a repetition of pain. Chapter 13. Healing from Trauma. Owning Yourself. The 13th chapter of The Body keeps the score, marks a pivotal transition in the book, shifting from the exhaustive documentation of what trauma does to the body and brain toward the possibilities of genuine recovery. Van der Kolk opens with a statement that is both simple and revolutionary. The core experience of trauma is the loss of self, and the core task of healing is owning yourself once again. This is not a metaphor or philosophical abstraction. It is a concrete, practical goal that involves reclaiming the body, the mind, and the capacity for agency and connection. He writes that for decades, the field of trauma therapy was dominated by the question of how to help survivors process their traumatic memories. The assumption was that if the memories could be neutralized, the symptoms would resolve. But Van der Kolk has come to believe that this focus on the past, while necessary, is insufficient. The ultimate goal of treatment is not just to help survivors remember and process what happened to them. It is to help them learn to live fully and freely in the present, to feel safe and at home in their own bodies, to know what they feel and what they want, and to act on their own behalf. This chapter lays out the broad principles and the overarching vision that guide the specific therapeutic modalities he will describe in the chapters to come. Van der Kolk begins by discussing the foundational importance of safety. Nothing else in trauma treatment is possible, he insists, until the survivor feels safe. This is not a platitude. It is a neurological requirement. The traumatized brain is stuck in survival mode, constantly scanning for threats and mobilizing the body for fight or flight. In this state, the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for reflection, insight, and learning, is effectively offline. A person cannot think their way out of a trauma response, and they cannot process new, corrective experiences because the brain is not in a learning mode. It is in an emergency mode. Safety, therefore, is not an optional luxury or a preliminary nicety. It is the essential precondition for any healing to occur. Van der Kolk distinguishes between two types of safety that are both necessary. The first is external safety. The survivor must be out of the dangerous situation that caused the trauma. A woman who is still living with an abusive partner cannot do deep trauma work. A child who is still being abused cannot heal. Ensuring external safety is the first and non-negotiable step. The second is internal safety, which is far more complex. Even after the external danger has passed, the survivor's body does not feel safe. The internal alarm system remains on high alert. The body remains tense, braced, and ready for catastrophe. Creating internal safety, Van der Kolk writes, is the primary work of the early and middle phases of trauma treatment. It involves helping the survivor learn to regulate their autonomic nervous system, to notice when they are becoming hyper-aroused or dissociated, and to use specific techniques to bring themselves back into their window of tolerance. This is not a cognitive process. It is a somatic, experiential process of retraining the body's alarm system. The second principle of healing that Van der Kolk discusses is the importance of befriending the body. He revisits the themes he explored in earlier chapters about the body-brain connection and the devastating consequences of disconnection from one's physical self. For many survivors, the body is not a home. It is a prison, a battleground, a source of pain and terror. They have learned to live from the neck up, ignoring the signals of their bodies because those signals are too frightening to feel. The first step in reclaiming the self, Van der Kolk argues, is to re-establish a relationship with the body. To learn to notice physical sensations without being overwhelmed by them. This is a slow, gradual process that requires immense patience. A survivor might begin by simply noticing the sensation of their feet on the floor, the temperature of the air on their skin, or the rhythm of their breath. Over time, they learn to track the subtle shifts in their internal state, the tightness in their chest that signals anxiety. the heaviness in their limbs that signals sadness, the fluttering in their stomach that signals excitement or fear. They learn that they can feel these sensations without being destroyed by them. They learn that sensations arise and then pass like waves on the ocean. This is the beginning of interoceptive awareness, the capacity to know what is happening inside one's own body. Van der Kolk writes that interoception is the very foundation of self-awareness and self-regulation. Without it, a person is a stranger to themselves, unable to know what they need or what they feel. With it, a person can begin to navigate their internal world with curiosity and compassion rather than fear. The third principle is the restoration of agency. Trauma, Van der Kolk explains, is fundamentally an experience of helplessness. The survivor was unable to prevent the terrible thing from happening, unable to fight back, unable to escape. This experience of being overpowered and out of control becomes encoded in the nervous system and in the very posture and movement of the body. Healing, therefore, must involve experiences of effective action. The survivor must discover, at a visceral level, that they can do something to affect their own internal state and their external environment. This begins with the small, simple actions of self-care, choosing what to eat, when to rest, how to move one's body. These may seem trivial, but for a person who has been systematically deprived of agency, they are revolutionary acts. Van der Kolk describes the profound importance of helping survivors find activities in which they can experience mastery and competence. This might be a physical activity like martial arts, or rock climbing, in which they learn that their body is strong and capable. It might be a creative activity like painting, writing, or music, in which they discover that they can give form to their inner experience. It might be an act of advocacy or service, in which they use their own painful experience to help others. What matters is not the specific activity but the experience of being an agent, of making a choice, of taking an action, and of seeing that action have an effect in the world. This is the antidote to the helplessness that is the core of trauma. The fourth principle is the integration of the fragmented self. Van der Kolk returns to the neuroscience of the default mode network and the sense of self, which he discussed in earlier chapters. Trauma, he explains, fragments the self. The various parts of the person, the child who was abused, the angry adolescent, the competent professional, the terrified inner child, become walled off from one another. The survivor may feel like different people at different times, with no coherent sense of identity that spans past, present, and future. Healing involves reintegrating these dissociated parts into a coherent whole. This is not about eliminating any part of the self, even the parts that are angry, frightened, or ashamed. It is about establishing communication and compassion among the different parts, recognizing that each part emerged as a survival strategy and that each part has something valuable to contribute to the whole. Van der Kolk writes that this integration often involves a process of grieving, as the survivor comes to terms with the full reality of what was lost and the full recognition of the pain they have carried. It also involves a reworking of the narrative of one's life, not to create a false positive story, but to create a coherent, honest story that makes sense of the past and opens the door to a different future. This narrative integration is a function of the explicit memory system, and it depends on the capacity for dual awareness that Van der Kolk described in the previous chapter. The survivor learns to tell the story of what happened to them without being swallowed by it, to own their history without being defined by it. The chapter concludes with Van der Kolk reflecting on the role of imagination and play in the healing process. He notes that traumatized people often lose the capacity for imagination, for fantasy, for the playful, creative exploration of possibilities that is the birthright of every human being. The future becomes a blank wall of dread, or an endless repetition of the past. Restoring the capacity to imagine, to envision a different future, to play with new ways of being in the world, is a crucial aspect of healing. This might involve theater, art, music, or simply the gentle encouragement to daydream, to wonder, to ask the question, what would I do if I were not afraid? Van der Kolk ends the chapter by emphasizing that owning yourself is not a destination that is ever fully reached. It is an ongoing practice, a way of living. It involves a commitment to staying present, to listening to the body's signals, to exercising agency, and to remaining in connection with oneself and with others. The chapters that follow will explore the specific tools and modalities that can support this journey: yoga, mindfulness, EMDR, theater, and neurofeedback. But the tools, van der Kolk insists, are only as good as the vision that guides them. The vision is of a self that is whole, embodied, and free. This is the promise of healing from trauma, not a life without pain or difficulty, but a life in which one is fully present, fully alive, and fully oneself. Chapter 14. Language, Miracle and Tyranny. The 14th chapter of The Body Keeps the Score examines the double-edged nature of language in the experience and treatment of trauma. Van der Kolk begins with an acknowledgement of the obvious. Language is one of the defining capacities of our species, a miracle of evolution that allows us to share our inner worlds, to coordinate our actions, to build cultures and civilizations, and to make sense of our lives. For trauma survivors, finding words for what happened can be a crucial part of the healing journey. Being able to say "I was raped," or "my father beat me," or "I watched my friend die" transforms a private, inchoate horror into communicable reality. It allows the survivor to break the silence and the isolation that so often compound traumatic suffering. It allows them to claim their experience as real and to seek the validation and support of others. Van der Kolk has witnessed countless times the profound relief that can come when a survivor finally puts their unspeakable experience into words, and is met not with denial or judgment, but with compassion and belief. In this sense, language is a miracle, a bridge from the solitary hell of trauma back into the human community. But the chapter is primarily devoted to the other side of this coin, the tyranny of language, the ways in which words can fail, distort, and even re-traumatize. Van der Kolk returns to the neuroscientific finding he presented in Chapter 3, the deactivation of Broca's area in the left frontal lobe during traumatic recall. When a survivor is in the grip of a traumatic memory, the part of the brain responsible for translating experience into speech goes offline. This is not a psychological resistance, it is a physiological reality. The survivor may be flooded with sensations, images, and emotions, but they are literally unable to put these experiences into words. When a therapist or a well-meaning friend or family member pushes the survivor to just talk about it, they may be asking for something that the survivor's brain cannot do at that moment. The pressure to verbalize can itself become a source of stress and shame, reinforcing the survivor's sense of being broken and inadequate. Van der Kolk writes that many of his patients have been re-traumatized by therapy that insisted on the verbal recounting of traumatic events before the patient had developed the capacity to regulate their arousal. They would try to talk, they would become overwhelmed, they would dissociate or have a panic attack, and they would leave the session feeling worse than when they arrived. The talking cure for them was a talking wound. Van der Kolk also explores the more subtle ways in which language can be tyrannical. He draws on the distinction between what the philosopher Wilhelm Dilthey called explanation and understanding. Explanation, in the context of psychology and psychiatry, is the process of fitting a person's experience into a pre-existing diagnostic category. You have PTSD, you have depression, you have borderline personality disorder. These labels can be useful in certain contexts. They can provide a framework for research and a shorthand for communication among clinicians. They can also provide a kind of relief for some patients who feel that their suffering has finally been named and legitimized. But Van der Kolk warns that diagnostic labels can also become a form of tyranny. They can reduce a complex, unique human being to a checklist of symptoms. They can obscure the personal history and the social context that gave rise to the suffering. They can lead clinicians to treat the label rather than the person, to reach for a prescription pad rather than taking the time to truly listen and understand. And they can become a prison for the patient, who begins to identify with their diagnosis, to see themselves as fundamentally defective or diseased, and to lose sight of their own capacity for growth and change. Van der Kolk quotes the French psychiatrist Pierre Genet, who said that every patient has their own unique language, and the task of the therapist is to learn that language, not to impose a foreign one. The chapter includes a powerful discussion of the phenomenon of storytelling and its relationship to the self. Van der Kolk notes that we are, by nature, storytelling creatures. We construct narratives of our lives that give us a sense of coherence, purpose, and identity. These narratives are not objective records of what happened. They are selective, interpretive, and constantly revised in light of new experiences. A healthy self is one that can tell a reasonably coherent story about its own life, a story that integrates successes and failures, joys and sorrows, and that can imagine a future that is connected to the past, but not determined by it. Trauma shatters this narrative capacity. The traumatic event is a rupture in the fabric of the self-story, an event that cannot be assimilated into the existing narrative because it is too overwhelming, too senseless, too foreign to everything the person believed about themselves and the world. The survivor is left with a gap, a void, or a jumble of fragmented, unassimilated sensory and emotional imprints. One of the tasks of healing, Van der Kolk acknowledges, is to construct a new narrative that can contain the traumatic experience, that can give it a place in the story of a life. This is the legitimate use of language in trauma therapy. The survivor is not just recounting facts, they are weaving a new story, a story that makes sense of the suffering and that restores a sense of continuity and meaning to their life. But Van der Kolk also warns against the seductive power of a too neat narrative. He has seen patients who can tell a polished, articulate, and emotionally flat story of their trauma, who can describe the most horrific events with clinical detachment, and who are no closer to genuine healing for having done so. The story is being told from the neck up by the verbal, rational brain, while the emotional and somatic core of the trauma remains untouched. This is the tyranny of the false narrative, the story that serves as a defense against the actual embodied experience. Van der Kolk writes that a genuine healing narrative is not a story that is merely intellectually coherent. It is a story that is felt, that is embodied, that carries the emotional truth of the experience, and that changes over time as the survivor integrates new layers of understanding and feeling. It is a story that can be told without dissociation, with the full presence of the self. And crucially, it is a story that does not end in victimhood. The survivor does not forget or minimize what happened to them, but they cease to be defined by it. They become the author of their own life, not a character trapped in a story written by their abuser or by their trauma. The chapter concludes with Van der Kolk reflecting on the therapeutic practices that can help survivors move beyond the tyranny of language toward a more integrated form of self-expression. He discusses the value of writing, not for an audience but for oneself, as a way of slowly, privately giving shape to the formless horror of traumatic memory. He describes the use of journaling, poetry, and unsent letters as tools that can bridge the gap between the nonverbal, somatic experience and the verbal narrative self. He also discusses the importance of therapies that do not rely on words at all, or that use words in a different way. The body-oriented therapies, the expressive arts therapies, the theater and movement practices that will be the subjects of later chapters. Language, he insists, is a tool, and like any tool, it can be used well or poorly. The trauma therapist's task is not to push the patient to talk, but to create the conditions in which the patient's own authentic voice can emerge, in its own time, and in its own way. When that voice finally speaks, stammering and uncertain as it may be, it speaks not just the facts of what happened, but the truth of a self that has survived and is ready to live. That is the true miracle of language, not the clinical recitation of symptoms and diagnoses, but the human act of saying, "This is who I am. This is what I have been through, and this is who I am becoming." The rest is just words. Chapter 15. Letting Go of the Past, EMDR. The 15th chapter of The Body Keeps the Score introduces the reader to eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, or EMDR, the therapy that Van der Kolk describes as one of the most surprising, controversial, and effective treatments for trauma that he has encountered in his long career. He begins with a candid account of his own initial skepticism. When he first heard about EMDR in the early 1990s, it sounded to him like a gimmick, a bizarre parlor trick masquerading as a serious therapy. The idea that asking a patient to recall a traumatic memory while simultaneously moving their eyes back and forth following the therapist's finger could somehow resolve deep-seated trauma seemed on its face preposterous. It violated everything he had been taught about how psychotherapy works. There was no careful interpretation of unconscious conflicts, no working through of the transference, no systematic challenging of maladaptive cognitions. There was just a memory, a moving finger, and, according to the early reports, a dramatic and lasting reduction in traumatic distress. Van der Kolk writes that he was prepared to dismiss EMDR entirely, but the reports from patients and clinicians were too numerous and too striking to ignore. He decided, with considerable reluctance, to investigate the method himself, to submit to the training, and to see with his own eyes what would happen when he used it with his own patients. What he discovered changed his practice and deepened his understanding of how trauma is stored in the brain and how it can be released. The chapter provides a detailed step-by-step description of the EMDR protocol as developed by its originator, Francine Shapiro. Van der Kolk explains that EMDR is not simply a technique of waving a finger in front of a patient's eyes. It is a carefully structured 8-phase therapeutic process that integrates elements of cognitive, somatic, and exposure-based therapies within a unique framework of bilateral stimulation. The first phases involve taking a thorough history, preparing the client, and establishing the resources and the self-regulation skills that the client will need to tolerate the processing. The client learns grounding techniques, safe place imagery, and ways to calm their nervous system before any traumatic material is approached. This preparatory phase, Van der Kolk emphasizes, is crucial and should not be rushed. It is the establishment of the internal safety that he has identified as the foundation of all trauma work. Only when the client has developed the capacity to stay present and regulated in the face of intense emotion does the therapist proceed to the assessment phase, in which the client identifies a specific traumatic memory to target, along with the negative belief about themselves that is associated with that memory, such as, "I am powerless" or "I am unlovable." The desired positive belief and the physical sensations that the memory evokes in the present moment. The core of EMDR is the desensitization and reprocessing phase, in which the client holds the traumatic memory in mind while simultaneously engaging in bilateral stimulation, most commonly eye movements. The therapist asks the client to bring up the image, the negative belief, and the body sensations associated with the memory, and then to follow the therapist's fingers as they move back and forth across the client's field of vision. After each set of eye movements, which may last 30 seconds or so, the therapist asks the client to report whatever came up. The client may report new images, new memories, shifts in body sensation, changes in emotion, or seemingly random thoughts. The therapist then instructs the client to go with that and begins another set of eye movements. The process continues, with the therapist serving as a calm, attuned, but relatively non-directive guide. Van der Kolk describes the process as having the quality of free association, but with a somatic, sensory focus and the constant, rhythmic bilateral stimulation. Over the course of a session or a series of sessions, something remarkable tends to happen. The traumatic memory, which was originally fragmented, sensory, and overwhelming, begins to shift. The vividness and the emotional charge diminish. The memory becomes more distant, more coherent, more like an ordinary, past-tense memory. The negative belief begins to feel less true, and the positive belief begins to feel more possible. The physical sensations in the body shift, often from tension, constriction, or numbness to a sense of openness, relaxation, or relief. Van der Kolk then turns to the question that has surrounded EMDR since its inception: how does it work? He acknowledges that the precise mechanisms are still not fully understood, but he offers a synthesis of the leading theories, grounded in the neuroscience of trauma that he has laid out in earlier chapters. One prominent theory is that the bilateral stimulation mimics the rapid eye movements of REM sleep, the stage of sleep in which the brain processes and integrates the emotional experiences of the day. During REM sleep, the eyes dart back and forth, and the brain is engaged in a complex process of consolidating memories, stripping away their excessive emotional charge, and integrating them into the larger network of autobiographical knowledge. Traumatic memories, van der Kolk explains, are precisely the memories that have not been processed in this way. They remain stuck, raw, and unintegrated, as if the brain's nocturnal processing system has failed in its job. EMDR, according to this theory, may kickstart this natural integrative process, allowing the brain to do, in the waking state and in a focused, intentional manner, what it was unable to do during sleep. Another theory focuses on the role of working memory. Holding a traumatic memory in mind while simultaneously tracking a moving finger is a demanding cognitive task. The working memory, the brain's limited capacity system for holding and manipulating information in the present moment, becomes taxed. This may reduce the vividness and emotional intensity of the traumatic memory, because the brain simply does not have the resources to maintain the memory in its full, distressing detail while also attending to the bilateral stimulus. Over repeated sets, the memory becomes less gripping and more manageable. A third theory, and the one that van der Kolk finds most compelling based on his own clinical observations and the neuroimaging research, is that the bilateral stimulation facilitates the reconnection of the two hemispheres of the brain and the reintegration of the fragmented elements of the traumatic memory. Trauma, as he has explained, involves a functional disconnection between the emotional right brain, where the sensory and affective fragments of the trauma are stored, and the rational left brain, which contains Broca's area and the capacity for language and narrative. The bilateral stimulation, by alternately activating the left and right hemispheres, may help to forge new connections across the corpus callosum, the bridge between the two hemispheres. This allows the raw, sensory, emotional fragments stored in the right hemisphere to be communicated to the left hemisphere, where they can be translated into language, placed in a temporal context, and integrated into the coherent narrative of the self. This is the reprocessing that gives EMDR its name. The memory is not erased. It is transformed. It moves from being a present tense reliving to a past tense remembering. The client can still recall what happened to them, but the memory no longer has the power to hijack their nervous system and plunge them into the hell of the original experience. Van der Kolk shares several clinical vignettes that illustrate the power and the sometimes uncanny rapidity of EMDR treatment. He describes a woman who had been raped years earlier and who had been unable to escape the grip of the memory. She had done years of talk therapy, which had helped her understand the dynamics of the assault, but had done nothing to reduce the visceral terror and the flashbacks. In a single EMDR session focused on the rape memory, she experienced a dramatic shift. The image of the rapist's face, which had haunted her for years, lost its vividness and its power. The feeling of being trapped and helpless, which had been lodged in her chest and throat, dissolved and was replaced by a sense of spaciousness and calm. She was not amnesic for the rape. She could still describe what had happened. But the memory had lost its sting. It had become a sad, unfortunate event from her past, rather than a living, present-tense nightmare. Van der Kolk writes that such rapid transformations are not typical for every patient or every trauma, but they occur frequently enough in EMDR practice to be remarkable. He notes that complex chronic childhood trauma generally requires longer and more gradual treatment, but the fundamental mechanism, the desensitization and integration of traumatic memory through bilateral stimulation, remains the same. The chapter concludes with van der Kolk reflecting on the broader implications of EMDR for the field of trauma therapy. He writes that EMDR has been subjected to more rigorous scientific study than perhaps any other trauma treatment, and the evidence for its efficacy is robust and well replicated. Yet it remains, in some quarters of the mental health establishment, a controversial and marginalized technique. Van der Kolk attributes this resistance to the same forces that have resisted the body-oriented and neuroscientific approaches he has championed throughout the book. EMDR does not fit neatly into the traditional models of either psychopharmacology or talk therapy. It does not involve medication, it does not involve elaborate interpretation or a protracted therapeutic relationship focused on the transference. It is a focused, efficient, and somewhat mysterious process that seems to tap into the brain's own natural healing mechanisms. For a profession that is often wedded to its theories and its guild interests, this can be threatening. But for the countless survivors who have found relief from the unbearable weight of traumatic memories, van der Kolk writes, The theoretical debates are irrelevant. What matters is that EMDR works and that it offers a path out of the past that is often faster and less painful than traditional approaches. It is not a panacea, and it must be used skillfully and within the context of a safe therapeutic relationship. But it is, van der Kolk concludes, one of the most powerful tools we have for helping people let go of the past and reclaim their lives. The eyes, it turns out, are not just windows to the soul. They may also be a doorway to healing. Chapter 16. Learning to Inhabit Your Body Yoga. The 16th chapter of The Body Keeps the Score explores yoga as a powerful and scientifically grounded approach to trauma recovery, and van der Kolk begins with a personal confession. For most of his professional life, he writes, he paid almost no attention to the body in his clinical work. He was a psychiatrist, a creature of the mind, trained to listen to words and to prescribe medications. The body was something to be examined by other doctors, physicians, cardiologists, gastroenterologists, and orthopedists, not by a mental health professional. But his research on trauma had led him to an inescapable conclusion. Trauma is not just a disorder of the mind. It is a disorder of the entire organism, and the body is the primary repository of traumatic memory. The heart races, the muscles tense, the gut clenches, the breath becomes shallow, and these physical responses do not simply go away when the danger passes. They become chronic, ingrained patterns that keep the survivor trapped in a state of perpetual physiological arousal, or numbing collapse. The logical implication of this understanding was that healing must involve the body directly. But van der Kolk, like most of his colleagues, had no training in any body-based modality and no clear idea of how to incorporate somatic work into his practice. The chapter tells the story of how he discovered yoga, initially with skepticism and then with growing astonishment, as a uniquely effective method for helping trauma survivors learn to inhabit their bodies and regulate their nervous systems. Van der Kolk was introduced to yoga by a series of fortuitous encounters with practitioners and researchers who were exploring the physiological and psychological effects of the practice. He describes his first visits to a yoga studio, his awkward attempts to place his body into the unfamiliar postures, and his immediate, visceral recognition that something important was happening. He noticed that the practice required a continuous, non-judgmental attention to the sensations of the body. Where is my foot? How does my hip feel in this position? What happens to my breath when I stretch my arms overhead? This simple, focused attention to internal sensation, which yoga cultivates systematically, was precisely the capacity that his traumatized patients lacked. They had learned, as a matter of survival, to ignore their bodies, to tune out the signals of pain, tension, and discomfort. Yoga, van der Kolk realized, was a structured, gentle, and profoundly effective way of teaching people to do the very thing that trauma had taught them not to do. To feel their bodies, to be present inside their own skin, and to notice the constantly shifting landscape of their internal experience. This was interoception in action, and van der Kolk was increasingly convinced that interoception was the royal road to emotional regulation and self-awareness. The chapter describes a groundbreaking study that van der Kolk and his colleagues conducted at the Trauma Center in Boston. A study that was one of the first to rigorously investigate the effects of yoga on chronic treatment-resistant PTSD. The participants were women with histories of severe childhood abuse and neglect, women who had been through every conventional treatment, medication, talk therapy, hospitalization with little lasting improvement. They were randomly assigned to either a yoga group or a control group that received a standard psychoeducational intervention. The yoga group participated in weekly, trauma-informed yoga classes led by instructors who had been trained to work with traumatized individuals. The classes emphasized gentle, accessible postures, a focus on the breath, and a constant invitation to notice bodily sensations without judgment. There was no physical adjustment by the instructors, because unexpected touch could be triggering for this population. There was no competition, no striving for perfect form. The message was simple. Notice what you feel, respect your body's limits, and use the breath to stay present. The results, van der Kolk reports, were significant and to many in the psychiatric establishment surprising. The women in the yoga group showed substantial reductions in PTSD symptoms, including intrusive memories, hyperarousal, and emotional numbing. They also reported improvements in their capacity to regulate their emotions, to tolerate physical sensations, and to feel at home in their own bodies. Many of them said in various ways that yoga had given them back a sense of ownership over their physical selves that they had never experienced before. Van der Kolk then unpacks the specific mechanisms through which yoga facilitates trauma recovery. The first and most obvious is breath. He returns to the polyvagal theory he introduced in earlier chapters and explains that the breath is one of the few autonomic functions that we can consciously control. We cannot simply will our heart rate to slow down or our amygdala to stop firing, but we can change the way we breathe, and by changing the breath, we can directly influence the autonomic nervous system. Slow, deep, diaphragmatic breathing activates the parasympathetic nervous system, specifically the myelinated vagus nerve that is part of the social engagement system. This sends a signal to the body and the brain that the danger has passed and that it is safe to relax. For trauma survivors whose autonomic nervous systems are chronically dysregulated, learning to use the breath as a tool for self-regulation is a profound and empowering skill. The second mechanism is the cultivation of interoceptive awareness. Yoga postures, by their very nature, produce intense and varied physical sensations. Muscles stretch, joints open. The heart beats faster during exertion and then slows during relaxation. The practitioner is continuously invited to notice these sensations, to track them as they arise, and pass away without reacting to them with fear or avoidance. This is a direct training of the insula and the medial prefrontal cortex, the brain regions that are crucial for interoception and emotional regulation and that are often damaged by trauma. The survivor learns that they can feel intense sensations without being overwhelmed, that the sensations are temporary, and that they have the capacity to stay present and grounded even in the midst of physical discomfort. The third mechanism is the experience of agency and mastery. Van der Kolk notes that trauma is, at its core, an experience of helplessness, of being unable to protect oneself or to escape. Yoga provides a safe, structured environment in which survivors can begin to reclaim a sense of agency over their own bodies. They learn that they can choose how far to go into a posture, that they can modify a pose to suit their own needs, that they can rest whenever they need to. They discover that their body is capable of strength, flexibility, and balance, that it is not just a source of pain and vulnerability, but a source of power and resilience. This discovery is often deeply moving for survivors who have spent years feeling betrayed by their own physical selves. The fourth mechanism is the integration of the fragmented self. Yoga, Van der Kolk explains, is not just a physical practice. It is a practice of unified, present-moment awareness. It brings together the body, the breath, the mind, and, in many traditions, the spirit. For a person whose self has been shattered by trauma, the experience of being whole and integrated, even for a few moments on a yoga mat, can be a revelation. It provides a felt, embodied template for what a healed self might feel like. The chapter also addresses the specific adaptations that are necessary to make yoga safe and effective for trauma survivors. Van der Kolk emphasizes that standard yoga classes, with their physical adjustments, their competitive atmosphere, and their emphasis on achieving particular aesthetic forms, can be triggering and counterproductive for this population. Trauma-informed yoga, by contrast, is built on a foundation of safety, choice, and empowerment. The instructor does not touch the students. The language is invitational, not commanding. Students are given multiple options for each posture and are encouraged to choose the option that feels right for their body in that moment. The focus is always on the internal experience, the felt sense of the posture, rather than on the external form. Silence and stillness are valued as much as movement. The goal is not to do the poses correctly, but to be present in the body, however that body feels. Van der Kolk writes that these principles, which seem so simple, represent a radical departure from the way most trauma survivors have experienced their bodies and their relationships with authority figures. The yoga mat becomes a laboratory for learning a new way of being, a way of being that is characterized by curiosity, self-compassion, and a gentle, persistent attention to the present moment. The chapter concludes with Van der Kolk reflecting on the broader significance of yoga for the field of trauma treatment. He acknowledges that yoga is not a panacea and that it is not a replacement for other forms of therapy, but he argues that it offers something that no amount of talking or medication can provide: a direct experiential path back into the body. For survivors who have been exiled from their physical selves by years of abuse, neglect, and terror, yoga can be the beginning of a homecoming. It can teach them, slowly and gently, that their bodies are not the enemy, that sensations are not to be feared, and that they have the capacity to feel alive, strong, and at peace. This is not a small thing. It is, Kolk writes, the foundation upon which all other healing rests. As long as the body is a source of terror, the mind cannot rest and the self cannot cohere. When the body becomes a place of safety, of exploration, and even of pleasure, the whole person begins to heal. Yoga, an ancient practice that long predates modern neuroscience, has turned out to be a remarkably precise and effective technology for doing precisely what the traumatized brain and body most need: learning to inhabit the present moment with awareness, acceptance, and a growing sense of peace. Chapter 17. Putting the pieces together. Self-leadership. The 17th chapter of The Body Keeps the Score introduces the reader to internal family systems therapy, a model of psychotherapy developed by Richard Schwartz that Kolk has found to be uniquely powerful in working with traumatized individuals. He begins the chapter by describing a clinical puzzle that has long haunted trauma therapists. Many survivors, particularly those with histories of chronic childhood abuse, report feeling fragmented, as if they contain multiple, conflicting selves. There's the angry child who rages at the slightest provocation. There's the competent professional who functions flawlessly at work. There's the terrified little girl who cowers in the corner. There's the harsh inner critic who constantly berates them for their failures. These different parts often have very different perceptions of the world, different emotional states, and even different physical sensations. Traditional psychiatry has tended to view this internal multiplicity as pathological, a sign of severe dissociative disorders like dissociative identity disorder. But Kolk, drawing on Schwartz's work, presents a radically different perspective. What if the mind is naturally multiple? What if we all have parts? And the difference between a healthy person and a traumatized person is not the existence of parts, but the relationships among them. This reframing, Kolk argues, is both scientifically plausible and therapeutically revolutionary. Kolk explains the core principles of the internal family systems model. The central idea is that every person has a self, with a capital S, that is the innate, core essence of who they are. The self is not a part, it is the ground from which all parts emerge and the natural leader of the internal system. When a person is in a state of self-leadership, they experience what Schwartz calls the 8 C's: calm, clarity, curiosity, compassion, confidence, courage, creativity, and connectedness. These qualities are not something that need to be learned or manufactured. They are the natural expression of the self when it is not obscured or hijacked by parts. Alongside the self, every person has a multitude of parts, each of which has its own perspective, its own emotions, its own memories, and its own role in the internal system. These parts are not, in themselves, pathological. They are adaptations, strategies that the organism developed at some point in its history to survive and cope with a challenging environment. The problem is not the parts exist. The problem is that parts can become extreme, rigid, and out of balance, and they can lose their connection to the self and to one another. This is what happens in trauma. The internal system becomes polarized and chaotic, with some parts taking over and others being exiled or suppressed. The IFS model divides parts into 3 broad categories. The first category is the exiles. These are the young, vulnerable parts that carry the pain, terror, shame, and grief of the traumatic experiences. They are the parts that were directly wounded by the abuse or neglect. Because their pain is so overwhelming, the rest of the system organizes itself to keep the exiles buried and out of conscious awareness. The exiles are locked in the basement of the psyche, frozen in time, still inhabiting the reality of the trauma. The second category is the managers. These are the protective parts that run the daily life of the person and work tirelessly to prevent the exiles from being triggered. They are the inner critics, The perfectionists, the workaholics, the people pleasers, the caretakers, the intellectualizers, they strive to keep the person in control, to avoid any situation that might activate the exile's pain. A manager part might drive a survivor to achieve at an extraordinarily high level, because achievement provides a sense of worth that counteracts the exile's deep conviction of worthlessness. Another manager part might keep the survivor socially isolated because relationships are dangerous and might lead to the reopening of old wounds. Managers are proactive protectors, constantly scanning the horizon for potential threats to the system's stability. The third category is the firefighters. These are the emergency protectors that leap into action when, despite the manager's best efforts, an exile is activated and its pain begins to break through into consciousness. Firefighters are reactive, not proactive. Their goal is to extinguish the pain immediately, by any means necessary. They are the parts that drive the impulsive, self-destructive behaviors that are so common among trauma survivors. Substance abuse, binge eating, cutting, suicidal gestures, violent outbursts, sexual acting out. These behaviors are not, from the IFS perspective, signs of moral weakness or character defects. They are desperate, last-ditch attempts by the system to contain an overwhelming flood of exile pain. The firefighter is like a person who throws a bucket of water on a kitchen fire without caring that the water ruins the floor. The immediate goal is to put out the flames. The long-term consequences are not considered. Kolk writes that understanding this framework can be profoundly liberating for survivors who often carry immense shame about their self-destructive behaviors when they can see that the part that drinks too much or cuts itself is not a monster, but a desperate protector trying, in a misguided way, to save the system from annihilation. They can begin to relate to it with curiosity and compassion rather than hatred and shame. The therapeutic process of IFS, as Kolk describes it, is elegantly simple in its basic structure but profound in its implications. The therapist helps the client to access their self and then, from that place of self-leadership, to turn toward their parts with curiosity and compassion. The first step is often to work with the protector parts, the managers and firefighters, that are most immediately present and active. The therapist might notice a shift in the client's posture or tone of voice and ask, "Is there a part that is showing up right now?" The client might identify a critical part that is telling them they are doing the therapy wrong, or a skeptical part that thinks this whole IFS thing is ridiculous. The therapist helps the client to unblend from the pot, to separate from it enough that they can be in a relationship with it rather than being completely fused with it, and taking its perspective as reality. This is the crucial distinction. Instead of thinking, "I am a worthless failure," the client learns to think, "A part of me feels that I am a worthless failure." That small linguistic shift represents a profound internal reorientation. The self is now present and is able to relate to the part rather than being hijacked by it. The client, from a place of self-leadership, can then ask the part what it is afraid would happen if it stopped doing its job, what it needs the client to know, and what it needs from the client. Over time, the protectors can learn to trust the self and to relax their rigid, extreme roles. Once the protectors have given permission, which is a crucial and non-negotiable step, the client can then turn toward the exiles. This is the most delicate and emotionally intense part of the work. The exiles carry the raw, unprocessed pain of the trauma, and approaching them can be overwhelming if the system is not adequately prepared. But when the self is present and the protectors have stepped aside, the client can begin to witness the exile's pain without being flooded by it. They can hear the exile's story, feel its feelings, and, most importantly, offer it the compassion and the care that it never received at the time of the trauma. This is the process of unburdening. The exile, which has been frozen in the past, can finally release the pain, terror, and shame that it has been carrying for years or decades. The client, from the place of self, can do for the wounded inner child what no adult did at the time of the original trauma. They can be fully present, fully loving, and fully protective. Kolk describes witnessing unburdenings in IFS sessions as some of the most moving and transformative moments he has experienced as a clinician. The physical and emotional shifts that occur are often dramatic and enduring. The client's body relaxes, their face softens. They report a sense of lightness, spaciousness, and peace that they may never have felt before. The pot that was exiled in the darkness has been brought into the light and welcomed home. Van der Kolk then links the IFS model to the neuroscience of trauma that he has developed throughout the book. He notes that the concept of the self maps remarkably well onto what neuroscientists call the default mode network, the network of brain regions that is active when the mind is at rest, and that generates the sense of a coherent, continuous self. The parts, by contrast, correspond to the various neural networks and subsystems that can become activated in response to specific triggers and that can, in traumatized individuals, operate in a fragmented and unintegrated manner. The process of IFS therapy, he suggests, is a process of neural integration. The self, grounded in the medial prefrontal cortex, learns to be the conductor of the internal orchestra, bringing the various parts into harmony, rather than letting them play in cacophonous isolation or silencing them entirely. This is not just a metaphor. Neuroimaging research has begun to show that effective psychotherapy is associated with increased connectivity and integration within and among the brain's major networks. IFS Van der Kolk proposes may be a particularly efficient method for facilitating this neural integration because it directly engages the fragmented inner world and provides a structured process for restoring the self to its natural leadership role. The chapter concludes with Van der Kolk reflecting on the broader implications of the IFS model. He writes that the idea that we all contain a core self that is inherently compassionate, curious, and calm is not just a therapeutic convenience. It is a profound statement about human nature. Trauma does not destroy the self. It obscures it, burying it under layers of protective parts and exiled pain. But the self is always there, waiting to be rediscovered. The task of therapy, from this perspective, is not to create a healthy person out of a damaged one. It is to remove the obstacles that prevent the person's innate health, their innate self, from emerging and taking its rightful place as the leader of the internal system. This is a deeply hopeful message for survivors who have spent years believing that they are fundamentally broken. They are not broken, they are burdened, and their parts are doing the best they can to manage that burden. With patience, courage, and the gentle guidance of a skilled therapist, they can learn to access their own inner healer, the self that has been waiting all along to welcome the wounded parts home. The pieces of the fragmented self can be put back together, not by force or by suppression, but by love. This is the deepest promise of the internal family systems model, and it is, Van der Kolk believes, one of the most important developments in the history of trauma treatment. Chapter 18. Filling in the holes, creating structures. The 18th chapter of The Body Keeps the Score addresses a dimension of trauma that Van der Kolk believes is often overlooked in the clinical literature, but is absolutely central to the lived experience of survivors and to the process of recovery. Trauma, he writes, does not just leave behind intrusive memories, dysregulated nervous systems, and fragmented selves. It also leaves behind holes, gaps in the basic structures of a life that most people take for granted. These are the structures of daily routine, of meaningful work, of stable relationships, of a coherent sense of identity, and of a vision for the future. For many survivors, particularly those who were traumatized in childhood, these structures were never built in the first place. They grew up in chaos with no predictable rhythms, no reliable caregivers, no sense of what a normal day or a normal life looks like. For others, the structures that did exist were shattered by the trauma, a career lost to disability, a marriage destroyed by the emotional fallout of PTSD, a sense of self dissolved in the acid of shame and despair. Healing, Van der Kolk argues, requires not just processing the past, but actively constructing the present. It requires filling in the holes, creating the external and internal structures that can support a life of safety, meaning, and connection. This is the often unglamorous, painstaking but essential work of the later stages of recovery. Van der Kolk opens the chapter by discussing the most fundamental structure of all, the structure of the day. He notes that for people who are severely dysregulated, the simple act of getting through 24 hours can be overwhelming. Sleep is disrupted by nightmares and hypervigilance. Eating is chaotic, driven by binging, restricting, or simply forgetting to eat. Work or school is impossible because concentration is shattered and interpersonal triggers are everywhere. The survivor may spend their days in a fog of dissociation or in a frantic whirlwind of activity designed to outrun their inner demons, or collapsed on the couch, unable to summon the energy to move. There is no rhythm, no predictability, no sense of moving through time in a coherent way. Kolk writes that one of the first and most important tasks of recovery is to establish a basic daily structure. This means regular times for waking and sleeping, for eating, for movement, for social connection, and for rest. It means creating a container for the day that is predictable and safe. A container that can hold the survivor when they feel like they are falling apart. This is not a trivial or patronizing intervention. It is a direct physiological intervention. The body's rhythms, the circadian cycles, the hormonal ebbs and flows, the autonomic nervous system's balance are all profoundly influenced by the regularity and predictability of daily life. A chaotic, unstructured day keeps the body in a state of low-grade stress, never knowing what is coming next. A structured, predictable day sends a continuous signal of safety. The survivor is not at the mercy of random events. They have a plan, a map for the day, and the simple act of following that map can be profoundly grounding. The chapter then turns to the structure of work and purpose. Kolk observes that meaningful work that provides a sense of competence, contribution, and identity, is a cornerstone of psychological health. This is true for everyone, but it is especially true for trauma survivors. The experience of trauma is at its core an experience of helplessness and uselessness. The survivor was unable to protect themselves or others, unable to change the outcome, unable to do anything that mattered. Meaningful work is the antidote to this profound sense of ineffectiveness. When a survivor engages in work that they value, whether it is paid employment, volunteering, creative expression, or caring for others, they experience themselves as an agent. A person who can make a difference, a person whose actions have positive consequences in the world. This is a powerful corrective to the learned helplessness that is encoded in the traumatized nervous system. Kolk describes patients who found their way back to life through the work, a veteran who began to heal by mentoring at-risk youth, a survivor of childhood abuse who became a fierce advocate for other survivors, an artist who transformed her pain into paintings that moved and inspired others. He emphasizes that the specific nature of the work is less important than the experience of engagement and mastery that it provides. The therapist's role is not to prescribe a particular career path but to help the survivor discover what matters to them, what they are good at, and what gives them a sense of purpose. Kolk also discusses the importance of creating structures of social connection. He returns to the themes of the attachment chapter, noting that humans are wired for connection and that trauma, particularly interpersonal trauma, shatters the capacity for trust and intimacy. Many survivors isolate themselves, not because they do not crave connection, but because connection feels too dangerous. Others repeat the destructive relational patterns of their past, seeking out partners who are abusive, neglectful, or otherwise recreations of their original caregivers. Building healthy relational structures is, Kolk writes, one of the hardest and most important tasks of recovery. It often begins with the therapeutic relationship itself, which provides a template for what a safe, attuned, boundaried connection can feel like. From there, the survivor may gradually expand their social world, joining a support group, reconnecting with estranged family members, or venturing into new friendships and romantic partnerships. The key is to proceed slowly, to pay attention to the body's signals of safety and danger, and to learn, often for the first time, the skills of healthy communication, asking for what one needs, setting boundaries, repairing ruptures, and tolerating the vulnerability of being seen. Kolk notes that group therapy can be an especially powerful modality for building relational structures, because it provides a laboratory in which survivors can practice new ways of being with others in a safe, facilitated environment. The group itself becomes a structure, a reliable, predictable community that meets at a regular time and place and that provides the container for relational healing. The chapter also addresses the internal structures that must be built or rebuilt in the wake of trauma. These are the cognitive and emotional structures that allow a person to make sense of their experience, to regulate their emotions, and to navigate the world with a sense of coherence and purpose. Van der Kolk discusses the importance of helping survivors develop a coherent narrative of their lives, a story that makes sense of what happened to them, and that points toward a meaningful future. This narrative is not a fixed once-and-for-all account. It is a living structure that evolves over time as the survivor integrates new insights and experiences. He also discusses the importance of developing explicit values and goals, the internal compass that can guide decision-making and provide a sense of direction when the old certainties have been shattered. For survivors who grew up in chaotic, abusive homes, these internal structures of values, goals, and coherent self-narrative may be almost entirely absent. They were never taught to reflect on what they believe, what they want, or who they are. Building these structures from scratch is a major undertaking, but it is also an exhilarating one. The survivor gets to decide, perhaps for the first time, what kind of person they want to be and what kind of life they want to live. This is the ultimate expression of agency, the reclamation of authorship over one's own existence. Van der Kolk then discusses the role of institutions and communities in providing structure for trauma survivors. He notes that many of the most successful programs for traumatized populations, whether they are veterans, refugees, or survivors of childhood abuse, are those that provide a comprehensive, structured environment. Therapeutic communities, residential treatment programs, and intensive outpatient programs offer not just individual therapy, but a full daily schedule of activities, responsibilities, and social interactions. They provide a container that is larger and more robust than what an individual therapist can offer. Within this container, survivors can practice new skills, experience the consequences of their actions in a safe environment, and gradually internalize the structure so that they can maintain it on their own. Van der Kolk acknowledges that such programs are often expensive and inaccessible, and he advocates for a broader societal investment in structured, community-based approaches to trauma recovery. He also notes that for many survivors, the structures of religion, spirituality, or 12-step programs can provide a crucial source of stability, meaning, and community. The regular rhythms of worship, meditation or meetings, the clear moral framework, the sense of belonging to something larger than oneself, these can be profoundly healing for people whose internal worlds are chaotic and whose external supports are lacking. The chapter concludes with Van der Kolk reflecting on the relationship between structure and freedom. At first glance, he writes, structure can seem like the opposite of freedom. It suggests rules, routines, constraints. But for trauma survivors, who are trapped in the chaos of their own dysregulated bodies and minds, structure is precisely what makes freedom possible. The predictable rhythm of the day provides the safety that allows for spontaneity. The reliable presence of supportive relationships provides the security that allows for exploration. The internal structure of values and goals provides the compass that allows for authentic choice. Without structure, the survivor is at the mercy of every internal storm and every external trigger. With structure, they have a foundation, a ground to stand on, a home base from which they can venture out into the world and to which they can return when they need rest and replenishment. Filling in the holes left by trauma is not a glamorous or dramatic process. It is the slow, patient work of building a life, piece by piece, day by day, but it is, Van der Kolk insists, the work that ultimately makes all the other work worthwhile. The goal of trauma therapy is not just to reduce symptoms, it is to help the survivor build a life that is worth living, a life that has meaning, connection, and joy. This is the work of creating structures, and it is the work of a lifetime, a work that continues long after the formal therapy has ended. Chapter 19, Rewiring the Brain, Neurofeedback. The 19th chapter of The Body Keeps the Score explores neurofeedback, a treatment modality that Van der Kolk describes as one of the most direct and powerful ways to rewire the traumatized brain. He begins by returning to a central theme of the book. Trauma is not just a psychological condition, but a physiological one, rooted in dysregulated brain circuits and an autonomic nervous system that is stuck in chronic hyperarousal or numbing collapse. Traditional therapies, whether talk therapy or medication, often fail to address this underlying physiological dysregulation directly. They work from the top down, trying to change thoughts and feelings, or from the outside in, trying to alter brain chemistry with drugs. Neurofeedback, by contrast, works from the bottom up, training the brain to regulate itself by providing real-time information about its own electrical activity. Kolk describes his initial introduction to neurofeedback in the early 2000s, his skepticism about what seemed like a science fiction technology, and his gradual, astonished recognition that this approach could produce profound and lasting changes in patients who had failed to respond to every other treatment. The chapter is a detailed account of what neurofeedback is, how it works, and why Kolk believes it represents a paradigm shift in the treatment of trauma. Kolk begins with a primer on the electrical activity of the brain. He explains that the brain is an electrochemical organ, constantly generating rhythmic patterns of electrical activity that can be measured by electroencephalography, EEG. These brainwaves are categorized by their frequency into several bands, each associated with different states of consciousness and arousal. Delta waves, the slowest, are associated with deep, dreamless sleep. Theta waves are associated with drowsiness, daydreaming, and creative reverie. Alpha waves, slightly faster, are associated with a state of relaxed, calm alertness, often described as being present and aware but not focused on any particular task. Beta waves are associated with active thinking, concentration, and at high levels, anxiety and hyperarousal. Gamma waves, the fastest, are associated with peak cognitive performance and the integration of information across different brain regions. In a healthy, well-regulated brain, these different frequencies coexist in a flexible, dynamic balance, with the brain moving fluidly among different states in response to changing demands. In a traumatized brain, this balance is disrupted. Kolk returns to the neuroimaging findings he described earlier in the book: the hyperactive amygdala, the underactive prefrontal cortex, the disrupted connectivity between the emotional and rational brain regions. These functional abnormalities are reflected in the brain's electrical patterns. The traumatized brain tends to be stuck in patterns of high-frequency beta activity, reflecting the chronic hyperarousal, or, in cases of numbing and dissociation, in patterns of excessive slow-wave activity, reflecting the shutdown response. The brain has lost its flexibility, its capacity to shift states appropriately. Neurofeedback, Kolk explains, is a technique that allows a person to observe their own brain wave activity in real time, and through this observation, to learn to change it. The process begins with a quantitative EEG, a brain map that records the electrical activity at multiple sites on the scalp and identifies the specific patterns of dysregulation that are present. The clinician then designs a training protocol tailored to the individual's specific brain. During a neurofeedback session, sensors are placed on the scalp to record the brain's electrical activity. The person sits in front of a screen and is given a simple task, such as watching a movie, playing a video game, or listening to music. When the person's brain produces the desired pattern of activity, for example, increasing alpha waves and decreasing high-frequency beta waves, the movie plays smoothly, the game progresses, or the music continues without interruption. When the brain produces the undesired pattern, the movie dims, the game freezes, or the music stops. This simple feedback loop operates below the level of conscious awareness. The person is not told to try to change their brain waves. They are simply instructed to watch the screen and let their brain figure it out. And remarkably, the brain does figure it out. Over a series of sessions, the brain learns, through operant conditioning, to produce the healthier, more regulated patterns of activity. The changes Kolk emphasizes are not a matter of conscious effort or willpower. They are a form of implicit learning, a retraining of the brain's automatic regulatory mechanisms. Kolk shares several clinical case studies that illustrate the transformative potential of neurofeedback. He describes a woman with a long history of severe childhood abuse and chronic treatment-resistant PTSD. She had been through years of talk therapy and multiple medication trials with minimal improvement. She was hypervigilant, emotionally volatile, and plagued by nightmares and flashbacks. Her quantitative EEG showed the classic pattern of a traumatized brain: excessive high-frequency activity in the fear centers and reduced activity in the prefrontal cortex. Van der Kolk describes her neurofeedback training, which focused on increasing her production of alpha and theta waves and decreasing her excessive beta activity. Over the course of 20 sessions, her symptoms began to improve dramatically. The nightmares stopped. The flashbacks became rare and manageable. She reported feeling calm and present in a way she'd never experienced before. Perhaps most strikingly, these changes persisted long after the neurofeedback training ended. At follow-up years later, she remained substantially free of the PTSD symptoms that had dominated her life for decades. Van der Kolk describes other cases: a veteran with combat trauma, a man with severe anxiety and anger problems, each of whom experienced significant, lasting improvement from neurofeedback after failing to respond to conventional treatments. The chapter also addresses the scientific evidence for neurofeedback. Van der Kolk acknowledges that the research base, while growing, is still smaller and less methodologically rigorous than the evidence for some other treatments, such as EMDR or cognitive behavioral therapy. Neurofeedback has been plagued by small sample sizes, lack of standardized protocols, and skepticism from mainstream psychiatry and neurology. Van der Kolk attributes this skepticism in part to the novelty of the approach and in part to the same guild interests and theoretical rigidities that have resisted other body-oriented and neuroscientifically based treatments. But he argues that the clinical evidence, the case studies in open trials, and the growing number of controlled studies is too compelling to ignore. He reviews the research that has been done, including studies showing that neurofeedback can produce significant reductions in PTSD symptoms, improvements in attention and executive function, and normalization of the brain's electrical patterns. He also notes that neurofeedback has a long and well-established track record in the treatment of other conditions, particularly attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, for which it is considered an evidence-based treatment with effect sizes comparable to medication. The biological plausibility of the approach, Van der Kolk argues, is strong. If trauma involves dysregulation of brain circuits, and if the brain is capable of neuroplastic change, then a technique that directly trains the brain to regulate itself should in principle be effective. The clinical results, he believes, confirm this principle. Van der Kolk then discusses the broader implications of neurofeedback for the field of psychiatry and for our understanding of mental health. He writes that neurofeedback represents a fundamental departure from the dominant medical model, which treats mental illness as a disease to be managed with drugs. Neurofeedback does not introduce any foreign substance into the brain. It does not suppress symptoms. It restores the brain's own capacity for self-regulation. It is, in essence, a training program, a form of physical therapy for the brain. This has profound implications for how we think about recovery. If the brain can be trained to regulate itself, then many of the symptoms that are currently managed with lifelong medication might be resolved through intensive targeted training. Van der Kolk is careful not to overstate the case. He acknowledges that neurofeedback is not a panacea, that it does not work for everyone, and that it is often most effective when combined with other treatments, including psychotherapy and body-oriented approaches. But he argues that it deserves to be a central part of the therapeutic armamentarium for trauma, rather than a fringe, alternative treatment. He also notes that the technology is becoming more accessible and affordable, with the development of home-based neurofeedback systems that can be used under remote supervision, potentially bringing this treatment to populations that cannot access specialized clinics. The chapter concludes with Van der Kolk reflecting on what neurofeedback has taught him about the nature of healing. He writes that watching a patient's brain learn to regulate itself is a profoundly moving experience. It is a reminder that the brain is not a static organ, fixed in its pathological patterns by genetics and early experience. It is a living, dynamic, constantly changing system that retains the capacity for growth and repair throughout the lifespan. Trauma may leave deep and enduring traces in the brain's electrical architecture, but those traces are not indelible. The brain can learn new patterns. It can literally rewire itself. Neurofeedback, van der Kolk suggests, is one of the most direct and powerful ways to facilitate this rewiring. It bypasses the limitations of language and the side effects of medication. It speaks directly to the brain in its own language, the language of electrical rhythms and frequencies. And in doing so, it can unlock a natural healing process that has been blocked by the overwhelming impact of trauma. The traumatized brain is not broken, it is stuck. Neurofeedback can help it get unstuck, restoring the flexibility, the resilience, and the capacity for presence that are the birthright of every human being. This is a message of profound hope, and it is a fitting culmination to van der Kolk's decades-long search for treatments that address the biological roots of traumatic suffering. Chapter 20: Finding Your Voice, Communal Rhythms in Theater. The 20th and final chapter of The Body keeps the score before the epilogue explores the healing power of collective embodied practices, specifically communal rhythms in theater. Van der Kolk begins by reflecting on a dimension of trauma that he feels has been underappreciated throughout his career, the profound isolation that it creates. Trauma is not just an individual affliction. It is a rupture in the fabric of human connection. Survivors feel cut off from other people, from their communities, and even from themselves. They cannot participate fully in the collective life of their families, their neighborhoods, or their cultures because they are trapped in a private hell of terror, shame, and hypervigilance. The healing modalities that van der Kolk has described in previous chapters, yoga, EMDR, IFS, neurofeedback, are all powerful, but they are primarily individual interventions. They take place in the privacy of a therapist's office or a yoga studio. They do not, by themselves, address the profound social dislocation that is at the heart of traumatic suffering. For full recovery to occur, van der Kolk argues survivors need to be reintegrated into the human community. They need to rediscover their voice, not just in the metaphorical sense of speaking their truth to a therapist, but in the literal, physical sense of using their bodies, their breath, and their voices in synchrony with others. This chapter describes two ancient, deeply human practices that have been rediscovered and adapted for the treatment of trauma: communal drumming and singing and theater. Van der Kolk opens the chapter with a discussion of rhythm and its fundamental role in human life. He notes that rhythm is everywhere in the natural world and in the human body. The heart beats in a steady rhythm. The lungs expand and contract in a rhythmic cycle. The brain generates rhythmic patterns of electrical activity. The hormones of the body ebb and flow in circadian rhythms. When a person is traumatized, these natural rhythms are disrupted. The heart races or slows to a crawl. The breath becomes shallow and irregular. The brain gets stuck in rigid, dysregulated patterns. Van der Kolk suggests that one of the ways to restore healthy regulation is through exposure to external, communal rhythms. He describes the work of researchers and clinicians who have used drumming circles, group singing, and dance as therapeutic interventions for traumatized populations. When a group of people drum together, their heart rates begin to synchronize. When they sing together, their breathing patterns align. This physiological synchronization, van der Kolk explains, is a direct, embodied experience of connection. It bypasses the verbal, rational brain and speaks directly to the limbic system and the autonomic nervous system. For a survivor who has felt utterly alone, the experience of being in rhythm with others can be profoundly healing. It is a visceral, felt sense of belonging, a return to the tribal community that is our evolutionary birthright. Van der Kolk describes his observations of a program that used West African drumming with veterans suffering from PTSD. The veterans, many of whom were initially skeptical and withdrawn, were given drums and taught simple rhythms. At first, their playing was chaotic and uncoordinated, but gradually, over the course of the session, something shifted. The rhythms began to cohere. The veterans began to make eye contact, to smile, to move their bodies in synchrony with one another. After the drumming, they reported feeling calmer, more connected, and less haunted by their intrusive memories. Van der Kolk explains the neurobiological basis for this effect. The act of drumming requires and cultivates interoceptive awareness, attention to the sensations of the body and the rhythm of the beat. It engages the motor cortex and the cerebellum, the parts of the brain involved in movement and coordination. It stimulates the release of endorphins and oxytocin, the neurochemicals of pleasure and social bonding, and the shared, synchronous activity creates a state of collective resonance that can be measured in the synchronized brain waves and heart rates of the participants. This is not just a pleasant diversion, it is a powerful, direct intervention at the level of the dysregulated nervous system. Van der Kolk notes that similar effects have been documented with group singing, particularly the kind of multi-part harmony singing found in many traditional cultures, which requires participants to listen carefully to one another and to blend their voices into a unified whole. The second half of the chapter is devoted to the use of theater in trauma treatment, and Van der Kolk describes this as one of the most exciting and unexpected discoveries of his career. He was introduced to this work through his collaboration with a theater company that had developed a program for trauma survivors. The program used techniques drawn from improvisational theater, role-playing, and scripted performance to help participants explore and transform their relationships to their traumatic experiences. Van der Kolk was initially skeptical. Theater, with its connotations of performance and pretense, seemed like the opposite of the kind of authentic, vulnerable self-exploration that trauma therapy requires. But he quickly discovered that theater, when skillfully facilitated, could provide something that traditional therapy often could not: a safe container for experimenting with new ways of being. The survivor is not just talking about their trauma, they're embodying it in a controlled, structured, and playful context. And then, crucially, they are embodying alternatives. They are trying on new roles, new postures, new ways of moving and speaking. They are discovering that the old, traumatic scripts are not the only scripts available to them. They can write new ones. Van der Kolk describes the specific techniques used in the theater program. One exercise involved having participants create physical statues representing their internal emotional states. A participant might shape their body into a posture of cowering fear, or explosive rage, or numbing collapse. The other participants would then mirror the statue, embodying the same posture and feeling into the emotional state it represented. This simple exercise, Van der Kolk explains, is a form of embodied empathy. It allows the survivor to see their internal state reflected back to them by others, to feel witnessed and understood at a deep, pro-verbal level. It also, paradoxically, creates a bit of distance from the emotion. By turning the emotion into a statue, a representation, the survivor gains a measure of perspective and control over it. Another exercise involved creating scenes with the survivor playing themselves at different ages, or playing their abuser, or playing a protective figure who intervenes. These scenes were not about achieving a perfectly accurate reenactment of the past. They were about exploring possibilities, about experimenting with new outcomes, about discovering that the old, inevitable story of victimhood could be rewritten. Van der Kolk describes a woman who, in a theater exercise, finally said the words to her abusive father that she had never been able to say in real life. The experience was not re-traumatizing. It was liberating. She had found her voice, literally and figuratively, and the act of speaking her truth in a supportive, communal setting had a transformative power that years of individual therapy had not achieved. Van der Kolk links the effectiveness of theater to the neuroscience of trauma. Theater, he explains, is a whole brain, whole body activity. It engages the sensory and motor systems, the emotional brain, the language centers, and the prefrontal cortex. It requires the integration of all these systems in the service of a creative, goal-directed activity. This is precisely the kind of integration that trauma disrupts. By engaging in theater, survivors are practicing, in a safe and structured environment, the very neural integration that they need to recover. They are also engaging the mirror neuron system, the brain system that allows us to understand and resonate with the actions and emotions of others. This system is often damaged or suppressed in traumatized individuals who have learned, as a survival mechanism, to tune out the emotional states of others or to misinterpret them as threatening. Theater, with its emphasis on embodied empathy and social interaction, can help to reactivate and retrain the mirror neuron system, restoring the capacity for genuine human connection. Van der Kolk also notes that theater, like communal drumming and singing, is an inherently collective activity. It takes place in a group. It requires cooperation, trust, and mutual support. The survivors are not alone in their healing. They are part of an ensemble, a temporary community that is working together to create something meaningful. The chapter concludes with Kolk reflecting on the broader implications of these communal approaches for the field of trauma treatment and for society as a whole. He writes that modern Western culture has largely lost the communal rituals and practices that have, for millennia, helped human beings cope with adversity and maintain their psychological and social equilibrium. We have medicalized suffering, turning it into a private problem to be treated with individual therapy and medication. But trauma, he argues, is not just a private problem. It is a social problem, and it requires social solutions. The communal rhythms of drumming, singing, and dancing, the collective storytelling and role-playing of theater, these are not New Age indulgences or fringe therapies. They are the recovery of ancient, deeply human ways of healing that our culture has forgotten. They remind us that we are not isolated individuals, but members of a tribe, and that our nervous systems are designed to resonate with one another. For trauma survivors who have been exiled from the tribe by their experiences, these practices offer a path back. They offer a way to find their voice, not just as a solo instrument, but as part of a larger chorus. They offer a way to rediscover that they belong, that they matter, and that they have something unique and valuable to contribute to the collective human song. This Kolk concludes is the ultimate goal of trauma recovery. Not just the reduction of symptoms, but the full, embodied, creative participation in the ongoing drama of life. Epilogue. Choices to be made. The epilogue of the body keeps the score, serves as both a summation of the book's major themes and a passionate call to action. Kolk opens with a reflective, almost elegiac tone, looking back over the decades of research and clinical practice that have shaped his understanding of trauma. He writes that when he began his career at the Boston Veterans Administration Clinic, he could not have imagined the journey that lay ahead. The word trauma was barely used in psychiatric circles. The diagnosis of PTSD did not exist. The idea that the body could hold the imprints of terrifying experiences, that the brain could be physically reshaped by abuse and neglect, that ancient practices like yoga and theater could be as effective as medication in healing deep psychological wounds. All of this was beyond the horizon of the profession's imagination. Now, after 40 years of scientific revolution and clinical innovation, the landscape is utterly transformed. We know, with a high degree of certainty, what trauma does to the brain and body. We know that adverse childhood experiences are among the most powerful predictors of lifelong physical and mental illness. We know that effective treatments exist, treatments that can restore self-regulation, integrate traumatic memories, and reconnect survivors with their bodies and their communities. And yet, Kolk writes, this knowledge has not been translated into practice on the scale that is needed. The vast majority of traumatized children and adults never receive the evidence-based, body-oriented relational care that could transform their lives. The choices that we, as a society, have made and continue to make are failing the millions of people who carry the invisible wounds of trauma. Kolk structures the epilogue around a series of specific choices that he believes we must confront if we are to address the hidden epidemic of trauma. The first choice is between a narrow, symptom-focused, medication-driven model of mental health care and a comprehensive, person-centered, trauma-informed approach. He reiterates the critique he has developed throughout the book that the current psychiatric paradigm is deeply flawed. It reduces complex human suffering to checklists of symptoms and treats those symptoms with drugs that often do not work very well and that can have significant side effects. It ignores the social and environmental context in which mental health problems develop. It fails to ask the fundamental question, what happened to you? The alternative, Kolk argues, is a trauma-informed approach that sees the whole person, that understands symptoms as adaptations to overwhelming experiences, and that prioritizes safety, relationship, and the restoration of agency and self-regulation. This approach does not reject medication entirely, but it sees medication as an adjunct to, not a replacement for, the deep, relational work of therapy. Making this choice, he writes, requires a fundamental shift in how we train mental health professionals, how we fund research, and how we structure our healthcare systems. It requires challenging the powerful economic interests of the pharmaceutical industry, which profits enormously from the current symptom suppression model. The second choice concerns our response to childhood trauma. Van der Kolk returns to the findings of the ACE study and the overwhelming evidence that early adversity is the root cause of a vast proportion of the suffering and dysfunction that we see in adults. He writes that we have a choice. We can continue to ignore this reality, to treat the downstream consequences of childhood trauma with medications, prisons, and emergency rooms, while doing nothing to prevent the trauma from occurring in the first place. Or we can choose to invest massively in early intervention, in supporting families, in protecting children, and in providing immediate, effective treatment to children who have been abused or neglected. This choice, he acknowledges, is not just a matter of health policy. It is a matter of social justice and political will. The children who are most vulnerable to trauma are disproportionately poor, minority, and marginalized. Addressing childhood trauma requires addressing the broader social conditions that breed it: poverty, violence, addiction, and the systematic deprivation of resources from the communities that need them most. Van der Kolk writes that if we were serious about reducing the burden of mental illness, addiction, and chronic disease, we would invest as much in safe schools, home visiting programs, and trauma-informed foster care as we currently invest in antidepressants, antipsychotics, and prisons. The science is clear. What is lacking is the moral and political commitment. The third choice concerns the role of the body in healing. Van der Kolk reiterates the central message of his book: the body keeps the score, and the body must be part of the healing process. He writes that we have a choice between a disembodied, purely verbal and pharmacological approach to mental health and an embodied approach that engages the whole person. The interventions he has described, yoga, EMDR, neurofeedback, theater, drumming, are not alternative or fringe treatments. They are evidence-based, scientifically grounded methods for restoring the body's natural capacity for self-regulation and reconnecting the survivor with their physical self. Yet these approaches remain marginal in mainstream mental health care. Most psychiatrists receive no training in them. Most insurance companies do not cover them. Most patients are never offered them. Van der Kolk calls for a revolution in how we conceive of mental health treatment, a revolution that puts the body at the center. He envisions a future in which every mental health clinic offers yoga and mindfulness training, in which neurofeedback is as widely available as medication, in which theater and drumming groups are as common as support groups. This is not a utopian fantasy, he insists. It is a practical, achievable goal if we choose to allocate resources to it. The fourth choice concerns the social and communal dimensions of healing. Van der Kolk writes that we have a choice between treating trauma as an individual medical problem and recognizing it as a collective, social challenge that requires collective, social solutions. He returns to the theme of the previous chapter, the profound isolation that trauma creates and the healing power of communal rhythms, shared rituals, and collective creative expression. He notes that in many traditional cultures, healing from trauma is not a private individual process. It is a community process involving the whole tribe in ceremonies, rituals, and shared expressions of grief and support. Modern Western culture has largely lost these communal practices, and we are the poorer for it. Van der Kolk calls for a reclamation of these ancient human ways of healing. He envisions communities that are trauma-informed, in which schools, workplaces, churches, and neighborhoods understand the impact of trauma and are equipped to respond with compassion and support rather than punishment and exclusion. He envisions a society in which survivors are not stigmatized and isolated, but are welcomed back into the human community and given the opportunity to contribute their unique strengths and perspectives. The epilogue concludes with a personal reflection from Van der Kolk on what his work with trauma survivors has taught him about the human condition. He writes that he has been privileged to witness the extraordinary resilience of the human spirit. He has seen people who have endured the most horrific abuse, neglect, and violence, and who have, against all odds, found their way back to life. He has seen the power of human connection to heal even the deepest wounds. He has seen that the capacity for recovery is not a rare gift possessed by a fortunate few, but a universal human potential that can be activated in almost anyone, given the right conditions. Trauma may be a fact of life, but it does not have to be a life sentence. The body keeps the score, but the body also keeps the capacity for joy, for connection, for creativity, and for love. The brain is damaged by trauma, but the brain is also capable of neuroplastic change throughout the lifespan. The self is shattered by overwhelming experiences, but the self can be reassembled, piece by piece, through the patient, loving work of healing relationships. Van der Kolk ends the book with a simple, powerful statement of hope and responsibility. We have the knowledge. We have the tools. The question is whether we have the will to use them. The choices we make as individuals and as a society will determine whether the millions of people who carry the invisible wounds of trauma will continue to suffer in silence, or whether they will be given the chance to reclaim their lives. This is not just a matter of professional responsibility for psychiatrists and psychologists. It is a matter of human responsibility for all of us. We are all, Van der Kolk writes, connected by the shared vulnerability of the human body and the shared need for safety, connection, and meaning. The trauma survivor is not a different species, a damaged other. The trauma survivor is us in different circumstances. By choosing to face the reality of trauma, to understand its impact, and to commit ourselves to the hard work of healing, we are not just helping those who have been directly affected. We are affirming the most fundamental human values: compassion, justice, and the belief that no one is beyond redemption. The book closes with an image of Van der Kolk sitting with a patient, bearing witness to their pain, and knowing with a certainty born of decades of experience that healing is possible. The body keeps the score, but the score can be rewritten. The choice is ours.